Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight, we're settling in with a question so ordinary that most of us hardly notice its strangeness at all. It lives in every conversation, every whispered secret, every late-night story, every argument over directions, every lullaby, every joke that only works because someone else understands the sound coming out of your mouth. We're going to spend some time with the moment humans learned to speak, or at least the long, complicated stretch of prehistory in which our ancestors stopped being creatures who could merely call, cry, grunt, and signal, and became creatures who could turn breath into meaning with astonishing precision. It sounds simple when put that way. After all, speaking is something many of us do all day without the slightest sense of effort. You open your mouth, a sentence appears, and before long you are discussing what to have for dinner, whether the weather can be trusted, and why someone absolutely did say they were bringing the good biscuits. But when you pause long enough to really consider it, speech is one of the strangest and most powerful things any animal has ever done. Somewhere in the deep past, among upright apes walking through changing landscapes, carrying tools, watching one another, raising children, and surviving by cooperation more than by claws, something changed. Not all at once, not in a single afternoon when one exceptionally bright ancestor stood up and announced a plan for mammoth season, but gradually across countless generations, bodies changed, brains changed, social life changed, and eventually sound itself became a far more precise instrument. A breath could become a signal could become a shared idea could become a memory, a warning, a promise, a plan, a rule, a story. And once that happened, human life would never again be limited to what one individual could see with their eyes in a single moment. Speech let minds connect. It let knowledge leave the body that discovered it. It let one person say, "Don't eat those berries," and another person live long enough to have grandchildren. Which, as revolutions go, is quite an impressive start. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what the last spoken words you heard were before this began. Maybe someone said goodnight. Maybe it was the television talking to itself in the background. Maybe it was you, muttering that you really should be asleep by now. There is something fitting in that question, because language is so familiar that we rarely notice how much of our world it carries. Even when we are alone, we often think in words. We narrate our errands. We rehearse conversations that haven't happened yet. We remember things in phrases. We silently complain about socks. Human life is saturated with speech so completely that it can be hard to imagine a version of us before it fully arrived. If you find this journey soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant way to unwind at the end of the day, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this little quiet corner reach other people who might enjoy a slower look at the strangest things on Earth. And now, let's take our time with a mystery that is both scientific and deeply personal, because every sentence you have ever spoken belongs to a story that began long before writing, long before cities, long before farming, and long before anyone had a word for word. One of the curious things about speech is that it hides its own complexity extremely well. Walking looks difficult when you see a child learning it. Writing looks difficult when you see someone first trying to shape letters. But speaking often appears effortless almost from the moment it starts to work. Children babble, experiment, mispronounce things in magnificent and inventive ways, and then, before long, they are making requests, asking questions, naming objects, negotiating bedtime, and delivering observations that are either surprisingly insightful or devastatingly honest. The speed of it can make language feel natural in the simplest sense of the word, as though it just emerges on its own once a human brain switches on. Yet that easy feeling is misleading. Speech depends on a remarkable stack of biological and cognitive abilities working together in real time. The lungs must control airflow. The vocal folds must vibrate in specific ways. The tongue has to move with extraordinary speed and accuracy. The lip shape fine distinctions. The ears monitor sound. The brain has to plan, sequence, interpret, remember, predict, and respond. And all of that must happen fast enough that conversation feels fluid, rather than like two philosophers trying to assemble a bookshelf without instructions. Even more remarkable is that speech is not just noise. Plenty of animals make sound, some of them beautifully. Birds sing, wolves howl, whales call across oceans. Gibbons produce elaborate vocal patterns in forests that can carry for impressive distances. Animal communication is rich, important, and often better organised than humans once gave it credit for. But human spoken language does something unusual. It allows us to combine a limited set of sounds into an effectively unlimited set of meanings. We do not need a separate call for every object, every danger, every emotional state, every memory, every future plan. Instead, we take small units and arrange them into larger structures, then arrange those into still larger ones. With that system, we can discuss rain that has not yet fallen, people who are not present, tools that do not yet exist, rules no one has broken yet, gods no one has seen, and recipes no one should improvise. It is a flexible, productive system, and once it appears in full force, it changes the scale of human cooperation. That is what makes the question of when humans learned to speak so fascinating. We're not merely asking when our ancestors began making more interesting noises. We're asking when the human line developed the anatomy, neural control, social dependence, and symbolic ability needed for complex spoken language. And the answer, frustratingly and wonderfully, is that no scientist can point to a single clean date and say, there, Tuesday, late afternoon, that was the moment. Speech does not fossilize. Words leave no bones. Grammar does not preserve neatly in cave sediments. We cannot dig up a sentence from 500,000 years ago and hold it up to the light. What we can do is gather clues. We can examine skulls and throats and hyoid bones. We can study genes linked to speech and language. We can compare our abilities with those of other primates. We can ask what kind of brain is needed to produce speech, what kind of social world would reward it, and what kind of body can support it. Then, with some care and a bit of humility, we can piece together the long story of how language became possible. And it really is a long story. The temptation is to imagine speech as a single invention, like the wheel or the zipper, but it was more likely a layering of capacities over time. Our ancestors did not go from silence to Shakespeare in one dramatic leap. There were probably gestures before full speech, vocal calls before full language, intentional sounds before syntax, shared meanings before elaborate grammar. There may have been long periods in which early humans had some of the equipment, but not all of it. Some vocal flexibility but limited symbolic range. Some social need for communication, but not yet the full cognitive machinery needed to speak the way modern humans do. In that sense, the history of speech is probably less like someone flipping on a light and more like watching dawn gather. At first, shapes emerge only faintly. Then patterns become visible. Then the whole landscape changes. It helps, perhaps, to start with the obvious but easy to overlook fact that humans are apes. We are unusual apes, certainly, but apes all the same. Our ancestors did not begin as silent creatures waiting patiently for language to descend from the heavens, like a very educational weather event. They already communicated in many ways. Like other primates, they would have used posture, facial expression, gaze, touch, movement, alarm calls, appeasement sounds, and social vocalizations. Communication did not appear from nothing. It evolved out of older systems that already mattered for survival. A mother had to comfort an infant. A group member had to signal danger. Rivals had to threaten without always coming to blows. Allies had to coordinate. Social life was already full of messages before language arrived. The question is what pushed those old systems towards something much more precise and much more open-ended. Part of the answer may lie in the environment our ancestors faced. Early humans were not living in a world that rewarded isolation. They were cooperative foragers, tool users, food sharers, child rearers in groups, and eventually hunters and gatherers operating in increasingly complex social settings. Cooperation brings enormous advantages, but it also creates new pressures. If survival depends on what a group can do together, communication becomes more valuable with every step towards social complexity. It is one thing to signal that a predator is nearby. It is another to indicate which direction it came from, whether it is still there, whether it is stalking or resting, whether the children have been moved, whether the fire should be kept going, and whether someone has once again left a perfectly good spear leaning against the wrong tree. The more humans depended on one another, the greater the reward for any system that allowed more detailed coordination. Then there is the matter of tools, which tell us something important about minds even when they do not tell us directly about speech. Making a simple stone tool already requires planning and motor control. Making a better one requires learning, imitation, practice, and increasingly fine sequencing. Some ancient technologies were stable for immense stretches of time, which is impressive in itself. Others eventually became more varied and more sophisticated. When tools change slowly but deliberately across generations, they suggest a species capable of social learning strong enough to preserve techniques. That does not prove full language, but it does hint at a world in which information mattered and could be passed on. Once teaching becomes more important, the advantage of clearer communication grows. You can show someone how to shape a stone, certainly, but being able to say more or say something like the precursor of more would make a difference. The body, of course, had to cooperate with the mind. Human speech relies on vocal anatomy that is both effective and in some respects oddly risky. Our vocal tract allows for a very wide range of sounds, but it also leaves us more vulnerable to choking than many other mammals. That is not the sort of design one would choose casually. It suggests trade-offs. Over evolutionary time, changes in the shape of the skull, the position of the larynx, the control of breathing, and the muscular precision of the tongue and lips may all have made more varied speech possible. Yet anatomy alone is not enough. A parrot can produce human-like sounds without possessing human language. The hardware matters, but so does the software, and in humans that software includes highly specialized neural systems for organizing sound into structure and structure into meaning. This is where the story becomes especially interesting, because speech sits at the meeting point of several kinds of evolution at once. There is the physical evolution of the body, there is the neurological evolution of the brain, there is the genetic evolution that shapes both, and there is the social evolution of a species that increasingly depends on teaching, cooperation, memory, and shared rules. The emergence of language likely required all of them. A body capable of nuanced sound without a brain capable of symbolic combination would not be enough. A brain capable of symbols without a social environment rewarding constant communication might not produce language as we know it either. It is the convergence that matters. Human speech may have become possible when a speaking body, a pattern-building brain, and a highly cooperative social life all began reinforcing one another. There is also a slightly humbling possibility worth considering. Once language started becoming more powerful, it may have changed the conditions of evolution itself. A group that could communicate better could cooperate better. A group that cooperated better could survive better. A group that survived better could pass on not just genes, but cultural knowledge at a greater rate. In that sense, language may not only have resulted from human evolution, it may have accelerated it. Once words became reliable carriers of information, culture could accumulate more efficiently. Skills no longer had to be rediscovered from scratch by every generation. Knowledge could be stored in living minds and transferred before death took it away. Stories could preserve caution. Names could organize social worlds. Spoken rules could shape behavior. Plans could extend further into the future. A species with language is not merely a species with a better communication system. It is a species that can build invisible structures together and then live inside them. That, perhaps, is why the origin of speech feels so important even now. It was not just another adaptation among many. It altered what a human group could be. Before complex speech, knowledge was trapped close to the present. After speech, experience could travel. A person could warn someone else about a distant place, describe a past event, invent a future possibility, explain a technique, negotiate a bond, or recount a myth that held a group together. Words allowed humans to coordinate beyond immediate perception. They let the dead influence the living through memory. They let the absent affect the present through report. They let imagination become socially useful. And once imagination becomes socially useful, history gets very busy indeed. Still, it is important not to get carried away and imagine our ancestors as either mute half-humans or fully modern speakers waiting for microphones. The real picture is almost certainly messier. Evolution usually prefers gradation to drama. There were likely many thresholds, many partial systems, and many long stretches where communication was good enough for the life being lived, but not yet what we would call language in the modern sense. Some hominin species may have had richer vocal repertoires than older theories allowed. Some may have gestured more than they spoke. Some may have possessed key anatomical features without full syntactic language. Neanderthals, for example, are now often discussed with far more nuance than they once were. The old image of them as grunting brutes incapable of anything resembling speech has not aged particularly well. As evidence accumulates, the line between who could communicate richly and who could not looks less simple than earlier generations imagined, and perhaps that is fitting, because one of the habits language gives us is the desire for sharp categories. We like clear borders. We like beginnings we can circle in red. We enjoy being able to say that on this side of the line there was no language, and on the other side there was grammar, gossip, and somebody complaining about the cold. But nature is rarely so tidy. Human speech was probably assembled the way many of the most important things in evolution are assembled, bit by bit, function by function, advantage by advantage, with older systems modified rather than discarded. Breath control that helped with one behaviour may have helped with another. Social intelligence useful for alliances may have supported symbolic understanding. Genetic changes affecting neural circuits may have made vocal learning more precise. The path was likely uneven, but over time it led somewhere extraordinary. So tonight, as we begin this story, it helps to hold on to two thoughts at once. First, speech is one of the most familiar things in your life. You use it casually, constantly, sometimes carelessly, and occasionally to explain to an appliance why it has betrayed you. Second, speech is one of the deepest mysteries in human history. It required an unusual body, an unusual brain, unusual social dependence, and a very long evolutionary preparation. Somewhere between primate calls and full human language, our ancestors crossed a threshold that changed what a mind could do when joined to other minds. That threshold did not just give us conversation, it gave us teaching, law, ritual, ancestry, planning, rumour, poetry, argument, instruction, memory at scale, and the ability to shape entire worlds made first of nothing more than sound. And to understand how that happened, we have to begin before the first clear words, before the first names, before speech became ordinary enough to disappear into the background of life. We have to picture a human world that was already social, already intelligent, already expressive, but not yet fully verbal in the way ours is. A world of gesture, call, attention, imitation, and shared activity. A world in which the capacity for language was being built piece by piece, long before anyone could ask the question out loud. Before there were words, there was not silence in the strict sense. The world was never quiet, and neither were our ancestors. Wind moved through grasslands, insects droned, birds announced themselves with unreasonable confidence at dawn. Water ran, cracked, dripped, or slammed, depending on where you happened to be standing. Branches snapped underfoot, Rain changed the whole acoustic character of a landscape in a matter of minutes. And among the apes who would eventually become us, there were already cries, warnings, grumbles, panting laughter, distressed squeals, mating calls, comforting murmurs, and the full range of sounds that social animals make when life requires constant negotiation. So, when we imagine the human story before speech, we should not picture a blank and wordless void populated by solemn creatures staring at one another in total muteness, like actors who have forgotten their lines. It was noisier than that, more social than that, and probably much more expressive than people once assumed. What was missing was not sound, but something more precise. There were no sentences yet, no way to build a thought from smaller parts and send it cleanly into another mind. There was no reliable spoken system for naming absent things, describing yesterday's danger, planning tomorrow's route, or explaining to a younger group member why one stone breaks cleanly while another behaves like an insult disguised as a tool. There may have been signals, many of them meaningful and even subtle, but there was not yet language in the modern human sense. That distinction matters, because the road to speech did not begin in stillness. It began in older forms of communication that were already doing important work. If we were able to stand at a safe distance and observe a group of early hominins long before fully modern language emerged, we would probably understand more than we expect and less than we hope. We might recognize urgency in a sudden alarm call. We might see reassurance in touch, posture, or a low calming sound directed toward an infant. We might notice that one individual can summon attention with a certain noise, or discourage another with a different one. We might even see patterned interactions repeated often enough to suggest a stable social meaning. But if we waited for someone to tell a story about a hunt from 3 days earlier, or explain a plan involving a river bend beyond the ridge, or make a joke based on deliberate wordplay, we would likely be waiting a very long time. That gap is the heart of the matter. Communication existed long before language, and our ancestors inherited much of it from earlier primates. Modern apes give us a useful, if imperfect, window into that older world. Chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas and orangutans all communicate through a mix of sound, gesture, facial expression, posture and touch. Some of their vocalizations are tied to specific situations. An alarm may differ depending on the kind of threat. A food-related call may bring others closer. A scream may signal distress, submission, or the beginning of social chaos, which, to be fair, is still how many family gatherings operate under pressure. Gestures can be flexible, intentional, and socially learned. A hand extended, a body turned, a branch shaken, a stare held a little too long, each can do communicative work. These systems are not trivial. They are effective within the worlds in which they evolved, yet they seem to reach a limit. Non-human primates can communicate a good deal, but they do not appear to possess the open-ended combinatorial structure of human language. They do not take a small set of meaningless sounds and assemble them into limitless meaningful strings according to shared rules that can grow with culture. A chimpanzee can certainly tell another chimpanzee something, but not everything. A warning can be given, a desire can be shown, a social mood can be displayed. But there is no strong evidence that wild apes narrate, debate, instruct in detailed sequential form, or describe imaginary situations to one another with anything like spoken syntax. Their systems are powerful in the context of ape life. Human language would eventually become powerful in the context of almost everything. That older communicative world was probably enough for millions of years. It supported bonding, conflict management, mating, parenting, coalition building and group movement. It helped animals survive. It allowed information to move, though within limits. But as the hominin line changed, those limits may have become more costly. Early humans were not simply apes doing ordinary ape business on a slightly different set of legs. Over time they entered ecological and social conditions that demanded more coordination, more learning, and more dependence on one another. Bipedalism changed mobility. Tool use changed interaction with the material world. Food sharing altered social dynamics. Longer childhoods increased the burden of teaching. Cooperative care of offspring meant more individuals needed to understand one another's intentions. And in groups where survival depended less on one set of teeth and more on the group's collective skill, communication became a form of infrastructure. Before words, a great deal had to be handled through immediate context. If you wanted to show someone something useful, you likely needed the thing itself present, or the place itself visible, or your own body available to demonstrate the action. Gesture would have been crucial here. In fact, many researchers think that gestures may have played a major role in the early stages of language evolution. Hands are wonderfully expressive. A direction can be indicated. A shape can be mimed. A sequence can be demonstrated. A request can be made visible. Among apes today, gestures often appear more flexible and intentional than vocal calls. Some can even be modified depending on whether another individual is paying attention, which suggests a degree of communicative awareness that is important for understanding how language might begin. One can easily imagine an ancestral world in which gesture carried much of the burden that speech later assumed. There is something plausible about that idea. Hands were already central to the human line. As tool use increased, the hand became not just a manipulator of objects, but a visible teacher. A person could show how to grip, how to strike, how to twist, how to carry. A child watching such actions might learn through imitation long before anyone could explain what they were doing with words. Shared attention, the ability for two individuals to focus on the same thing and know they are doing so, would have been especially important. A point, a glance, a lifted chin towards some distant object. These are tiny acts, but cognitively significant ones. They depend on understanding that another mind can be directed towards something in the world. Language later rides on that ability constantly. Before speech, it may have grown in quieter forms. Still, gesture has limits of its own. It works best when others can see you. It is less useful in darkness, at distance, through thick vegetation, or when both hands are occupied with carrying food, infants, or tools. Sound has advantages. It travels around obstacles. It reaches individuals who are not looking. It can be produced while the hands do other jobs. For a species becoming increasingly dependent on cooperation across varied settings, vocal communication would have been a powerful avenue to expand. The question, again, is how that expansion happened. It is one thing to make more sounds. It is another to gain the fine motor control, breath regulation, auditory discrimination, and neural sequencing required for articulated speech. The transition likely involved a long period in which vocalization became more flexible before it became fully linguistic. Imagine communication systems growing denser over time. A call that once meant something broad like danger might begin to differentiate into more specific patterns. Social sounds might vary with individual identity, emotional nuance or intention. Rhythms of turn-taking could become more stable. Infants might spend longer periods babbling and experimenting, with adults becoming increasingly attentive to those sounds. Vocal learning, which is limited in non-human primates compared with humans, may have strengthened gradually. This would matter enormously. Human babies do not merely inherit a fixed vocal repertoire. They learn the sound system around them, practicing, listening, failing, adjusting, and trying again with heroic persistence and no concern whatsoever for how early it is in the morning. That learning capacity is one of the foundations of speech. It is also worth remembering that before language became a tool for formal knowledge transfer, communication was already a tool for social bonding. In primates, grooming plays a large role in maintaining relationships. It calms, reassures, builds alliances, and reduces conflict. But grooming is time-consuming and physically limited. You can groom one or two individuals at a time. As hominin group sizes grew, some researchers have suggested that vocal bonding may have supplemented this older social glue. Simple vocal exchanges, rhythmic sounds, early forms of collective vocal behavior, perhaps even proto-conversational murmuring, may have helped keep groups cohesive when hands-on grooming no longer scaled efficiently. It is a striking idea. Speech may owe part of its eventual success not only to information sharing, but to the social need to maintain large networks of trust and attention. In that sense, one ancestor speaking more flexibly may not have begun by delivering a lecture on stone fracture mechanics. They may simply have become better at being socially present to more people at once. There is a temptation when thinking about pre-language humans to focus only on what they lacked, but this can distort the picture. These were not dim creatures waiting passively for grammar to rescue them. They were capable of perception, memory, planning, emotional complexity, and social strategy. They could learn from experience. They could likely understand sequences of action and cause. They certainly cared about group members, offspring, resources, danger, and status. What they may not have possessed yet was the full means to externalize these mental contents into structured speech. That distinction matters because it suggests that much of human-like thought may have deep roots older than language itself. The mind could already represent a good deal before it could narrate itself out loud. At the same time, language probably changed thought once it emerged more fully. But before that turning point, cognition had to make do with what perception, memory, gesture, and limited vocal systems could manage. A hunting plan, if it existed at all, might have relied heavily on routine, mutual familiarity, and practiced behaviour rather than spoken explanation. Tool traditions would have been preserved more by watching than by telling. Social rules may have been enforced through repeated interaction and emotional response, rather than explicit verbal instruction. Memory would have been more tied to place, action, and visible sequence than to narrative retelling. None of this means early humans were simple. It means their intelligence was embedded more directly in bodies, habits, and shared situations. Think for a moment about how much of your own life can be handled without words. You can recognize anger on a face before a sentence is spoken. You can comfort someone with touch alone. You can understand invitation from posture, urgency from movement, disapproval from a look that says more than a full paragraph ever could. You can learn certain physical tasks by watching rather than hearing them explained. Human beings remain exquisitely sensitive to non-verbal communication, which makes sense if our lineage spent a vast amount of time relying on exactly that. Speech did not replace the old systems completely. It layered over them. Even now, conversation depends on rhythm, tone, gaze, pause, emphasis, expression, and body position. Words do a great deal of work, but they do not work alone. And yet words transformed the scale of what communication could carry. Before they arrived, there would have been a sharp constraint on displacement, the ability to refer to things not present here and now. This is one of the great powers of language, and one of the reasons it remade human life so thoroughly. Without displacement, communication stays tethered to the immediate world. There is food here. Danger now. Come closer. Go away. I am upset. I am reassured. Useful, certainly. Necessary, absolutely. But once communication can reach beyond the present, everything changes. A person can say that something happened elsewhere. A person can warn of a predator seen earlier. A person can suggest trying something new tomorrow. A person can refer to someone absent, a place distant, a season expected, a dead relative remembered, a child not yet born. That capacity builds a social world larger than immediate perception. It is hard to know exactly when this threshold was crossed, but before it was, life would have been more local in a cognitive sense, even if it was rich in experience. Knowledge stayed closer to the event that produced it. Learning depended heavily on direct exposure. If a child was not present for the demonstration, the opportunity could be lost. If an experienced individual died, much of what they knew might vanish with them unless preserved in repeated practice visible to others. Culture existed, but its carrying capacity was smaller. It could accumulate only so much before the lack of precise communication became a break. The strange thing is that this pre-verbal world was probably still deeply human in many ways we would recognize. There would have been affection, rivalry, grief, play, curiosity, fear, persistence, pride in competence, attention to status, concern for children, sensitivity to fairness within the group, and perhaps even forms of shared ritual or collective rhythm. Music, or at least rhythmic coordinated vocalization, may have older roots than full language. Lullaby-like soothing patterns may have existed long before words for sleep. Emotional sound is ancient. A mother does not need syntax to calm an infant. A group does not need grammar to move together under pressure. Shared vocal patterns may have built trust and anticipation before they built statements. There is also the role of silence itself, or at least of communicative gaps. In a world without words, more had to be inferred. Minds still had to read one another, perhaps with greater dependence on context than modern humans are used to. Someone returning to camp empty-handed, moving differently, carrying the scent of alarm or blood, may have conveyed a great deal before a single sound was made. Others would have been under strong pressure to interpret rapidly. Social cognition, the ability to infer what another individual knows, intends, or feels, may have been sharpening long before language gave it a vast new toolkit. In fact, speech might have grown out of minds already well practiced in reading one another. Once those minds acquired a more precise signalling system, communication could become dramatically more efficient because the audience was already primed for intention. Of course, efficiency is not always graceful. Early communication may have been full of ambiguity, repetition, and failure. Signals get missed, gestures are obscured, calls are misread. An ancestor attempting to convey something useful may have been met with confusion, indifference, or the prehistoric equivalent of nodding politely while understanding absolutely nothing. One should never romanticize the process too much. Evolution works with what is available, not with ideal designs. The path to language was probably full of clumsy half-solutions, but those half-solutions matter. Each small increase in clarity, flexibility, and shared meaning could bring real benefits, especially in a species increasingly dependent on social learning. Infants may have been among the strongest forces driving this process. Human babies are unusual in many ways. They are born relatively helpless, they develop slowly, and they demand enormous amounts of care. That prolonged childhood creates both a burden and an opportunity. A longer developmental period allows more learning. It also creates a powerful arena for vocal interaction. Adults attend closely to infant sounds. Infants babble incessantly, experimenting with control over the vocal tract in what can only be described as tireless acoustic research. In modern humans, this process is critical for language acquisition. In evolutionary time, increasing responsiveness between caregivers and infants may have helped shape more flexible vocal communication. A species that invests so much in teaching its young has strong incentives to improve the channels through which learning happens. Then there is fire, though exactly when controlled fire became widespread enough to shape communication in a major way remains debated. Even so, the image is useful because it captures something about shared time. Once hominins spent longer periods gathered in relative safety, rather than only reacting to immediate tasks, opportunities for social exchange expanded. Evening sociality around protected spaces may have rewarded more varied communication, more attention to sound, more turn-taking, more memory shared across individuals. Language does not spring automatically from sitting together, of course, but social environments that create sustained shared attention are fertile ground for communicative elaboration. A group with more time to watch, imitate, soothe, coordinate, and perform social identity is a group in which communication can become more central. When people speak about the moment humans learn to speak, it is usually a shorthand for something much messier, a long transition from a world where meaning lived mostly in immediate signals and embodied action to a world where meaning could be built, stored, and transmitted through structured sound. Before that transition was complete, our ancestors inhabited a threshold state. They were not voiceless, and they were not yet fully verbal. They lived in a communicative landscape rich with expression but constrained in reach. They could call, gesture, infer, soothe, threaten, invite and coordinate. They could probably do far more than older theories once allowed. But they could not yet do what language would eventually permit so casually that modern humans now waste it arguing about whether a sandwich counts as a salad under certain unfortunate circumstances. That earlier world deserves attention precisely because it was not empty. It was the groundwork. It was the long apprenticeship before speech became powerful enough to reshape human history. In it, bodies were already signalling, minds were already reading, groups were already depending on one another, and evolution was already experimenting with what communication might become if pushed by social need, cognitive growth, and anatomical possibility. The silence before words was not an absence of life. It was a crowded, noisy, intelligent interval in which the old forms were being stretched towards something new, and the creatures living through it were already becoming the sort of beings for whom speech would not simply be useful, but eventually indispensable. At some point in the long and untidy history of our lineage, there was an ape that did not merely react more quickly, climb more efficiently, or strike stones more cleverly. There was an ape that began to mean more. Not in the moral sense, though one suspects every species would quite like to believe it is the important one, but in the communicative sense. A gesture meant more than an immediate emotion. A sound meant more than simple alarm. An action carried more than the action itself. Something in the human line began to push beyond expression and toward intention with greater depth, greater flexibility, and greater consequence. That shift may have been gradual enough that no individual ever noticed it happening, but over evolutionary time it changed everything. When we say that an early hominin began to mean more, we're really talking about a widening gap between signal and circumstance. In many animals, communication is tightly bound to the present moment. A threat produces a threat display. Fear produces an alarm. Submission produces a lowering of the body, an averting of gaze or a particular vocalization. These systems work, and they work well enough to sustain complex social lives. But they tend to remain anchored to immediate conditions. Human communication eventually became different because it could detach itself from the here and now. A signal no longer needed to be only a reflex or only a fixed response. It could become increasingly intentional, increasingly referential, and increasingly shaped by what one mind wanted another mind to understand. That is a very different sort of communicative world. It helps to remember again that our ancestors were never blank slates. By the time the hominin line was well underway, our predecessors were already living inside highly social groups where survival depended on constant interpretation. They watched one another closely. They tracked rank, alliance, irritation, desire, and trust. They recognized faces, remembered interactions, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Social life among primates is not simple. It is dense with negotiation, compromise, opportunism, and emotional consequence. An individual that could understand others slightly better, or guide the attention of others slightly more effectively, would hold an advantage. Not a dramatic one at first, perhaps, but enough for natural selection to notice over very long spans of time. Among modern apes, there are already hints of what this older communicative intelligence looked like. Chimpanzees and bonobos, for instance, do not only produce sounds. They gesture in intentional ways. They may repeat a gesture if it is ignored, switch to another one if the first fails, and direct it differently depending on whether another individual can see them. That matters because it suggests a communicative system that is not merely reflexive. It shows some awareness of audience, some understanding that a signal has to be received to work. A chimpanzee trying to initiate grooming or play is not just making noise into the universe and hoping for the best. It is engaging another mind, however differently from how a human speaker would do so. These are not language, but they are not nothing. They are pieces of the older toolkit from which language could eventually emerge. The hominin story likely became interesting when selection began rewarding not just social awareness, but increasing precision in shared intention. Consider how many daily problems early humans had to solve together. A group needed to move through landscapes that were changing with climate and season. It needed to locate food that might be scattered, hidden, dangerous, or difficult to extract. It needed to protect young, avoid predators, manage internal tensions, and preserve useful habits of tool use. Much of this could be handled through demonstration, imitation, and routine, but the more flexible the environment and the more varied the challenges, the more useful it became to communicate not merely an emotional state but a directed piece of meaning. Look there, bring that, wait, not yet, follow me, that one, not this one. A system that could make such distinctions with greater reliability would be a gift to a cooperative species. The body and the social world were changing together. Bipedalism freed the hands, and freed hands changed everything from carrying to tool use to infant care. Once hands became less tied to locomotion, they could do more visible communicative work as well. Gesture may have flourished in such a world. An upright body is easier to read at a distance than one bent to the ground on all fours. A lifted arm, a hand shape, a turn of the torso, a deliberate placement of an object all become more available as signals when the body is no longer occupied by constant knuckle-supported movement. This is one reason many researchers have taken gesture-first theories of language evolution seriously. The idea is not that speech suddenly replaced gesture from nowhere, but that communicative intention may have deepened first in a visual manual medium before moving more fully into the vocal one. There is a practical logic to that. Gestures can be iconic. They can resemble the thing they refer to. One can mimic a throwing motion, a digging action, the shape of an animal horn, the direction of the movement. For a species already learning by watching, such visible signs would be useful. If an early hominin wanted to recruit another for some task, or warn of some recurring danger, gesture could carry meaning in a way that fixed calls could not. Over time, repeated gestures might stabilize into conventional ones within groups. Once that happens, communication is already beginning to drift towards symbolism. A sign no longer has to be freshly invented each time. It can be recognized because the group has come to share it. That is a small but enormous step. Shared convention is one of the foundations of language. At the same time, vocal communication offered advantages gesture could not. A sound works in darkness. It works when attention is not already directed toward the signaler. It works when hands are busy. It can accompany movement rather than interrupt it. And for a species spending more time foraging cooperatively, carrying things, managing children, and moving through complex terrain, these are not minor benefits. The ape who began to mean more may therefore have been an ape, in whom gesture and vocalization were both becoming more flexible, more intentional, and more integrated. Perhaps the hand first carried nuance that the voice later learned to support. Perhaps the voice began to take over because it could do some of the same work more efficiently. In humans today, speech and gesture remain deeply linked. We still talk with our hands because the old partnership never really ended. Another important development was probably joint attention. This is one of those psychological abilities that seems simple until you imagine trying to build language without it. Joint attention means that two individuals can focus on the same thing and understand that they are sharing that focus. A person points at a berry patch, and the other person does not merely look at the finger as though it has become interesting on its own merits. They look past it to the intended object and understand that the pointer intends them to do so. Human infants develop this ability early, and it is central to language learning. Words map onto the world partly because adults and children can align attention toward the same thing. Without that, naming becomes maddeningly difficult. The early ape who began to mean more may have been an ape increasingly good at shared attention, increasingly able not just to react together, but to know they were reacting together. This ability opens the door to reference. Reference is where communication begins to exceed immediate feeling. A growl may reveal irritation, but a referential signal can indicate something external to the signaller. That is a crucial distinction. If one individual can direct another's attention toward an object, place, event, or absent expectation, then communication has started doing more than displaying internal state. It has begun to represent the world. Some animal calls may carry limited referential information, especially alarm systems tied to specific predators. But human language takes reference to a different level entirely. It can refer not just to what is there, but to what was there, what will be there, what could be there, and what ought not to be there but somehow still is because someone failed to clean up after themselves. The social brain hypothesis becomes useful here. Human brains did not expand in a vacuum. Large, metabolically expensive brains need reasons to exist. One influential idea is that increasingly complex social life drove part of this expansion. To keep track of larger groups, more unstable alliances, more subtle rank dynamics, and longer periods of dependency and offspring, our ancestors needed enhanced memory, prediction, and interpretive skill. If that is true, then the growth of meaning-rich communication may have been both a product and a driver of this social complexity. Better social cognition makes better communication possible. Better communication allows more elaborate social structures. Those social structures then reward still more cognitive sophistication. It becomes a feedback loop, one with very large consequences over evolutionary time. Tool use likely intensified this loop. Stone tools, wooden implements, processing methods, and later more advanced technologies do not simply exist. They have to be learned, preserved, repaired, and improved. Some can be copied by observation alone, especially simpler ones. But as techniques become more sequential and less obvious, the cost of imprecise teaching rises. A learner benefits from having their attention directed not just to the finished product, but to the relevant steps. Strike here, not there. Use this grip, turn the core, wait for the right angle, keep the edge. Even if such instructions were first carried by gesture, grunt, posture, or repeated demonstration, the pressures favouring more controlled communication would be obvious. Any group better at transmitting skill would hold an advantage. Culture would become more stable, and once culture becomes more stable, selection may begin favouring the minds and bodies that handle cultural transmission best. This is one reason the phrase, "the ape who began to mean more," is so useful. It suggests that the big shift was not only about making new sounds, it was about packing more intention into behaviour. A look could become more directed, a gesture could become more conventional, a vocalisation could become less tied to a fixed emotion and more shaped by context. An object placed deliberately could become part of a communicative act, meaning expanded before grammar fully arrived. The communicative repertoire became more elastic, and when that happens, minds on both sides of the exchange have to grow with it. The signaller must become better at producing intentional cues. The receiver must become better at interpreting intention, rather than simply reacting to stimulus. Communication becomes a cooperative cognitive achievement. This raises an interesting possibility about the evolution of trust. For communication to become more abstract and more useful, receivers must learn that certain signals are worth attending to, even when the thing signalled is not immediately obvious. If someone produces a special call or gesture indicating food beyond the ridge, others need some reason to respond. That means the social environment matters. In species where cheating overwhelms cooperation, communication can degrade. But in groups where kinship, repeated interaction, mutual dependence, and social monitoring make honest signalling often beneficial, more informative communication can flourish. Human ancestors were unusually cooperative compared with most primates in several key ways, including food sharing and alloparenting. These may have created the social conditions in which meaning-rich signals paid off more reliably. There is also the matter of time depth. The ability to mean more depends partly on memory. A creature can only refer flexibly to the world if it can represent the world with some detail beyond immediate sensation. Human memory is not a perfect recording system. And perhaps it is just as well because most of us already spend enough time reliving the wrong thing said in a conversation 6 years ago. But even so, humans have powerful episodic and social memory. We remember who did what, where, and under what circumstances. Some of these capacities have roots deep in the primate past. The hominins in whom communication became more referential may have been those increasingly able to link signals to stored experiences and expected outcomes. If one can remember the location of a water source, the danger associated with a patch of ground, or the tool-making skill of a particular group member, one is closer to needing a system that can convey such knowledge efficiently. Children again may have been central. Human childhood is exceptionally long, and that means learning occupies an unusually large share of life. In a lineage where juveniles must absorb immense amounts of knowledge about tools, foods, social norms, movement, danger and care, adults who can guide attention effectively become very valuable. So do young who are especially good at reading communicative cues. Over time, this may have created a powerful selection pressure on both teaching behaviour and teachability. Human children are not passive recipients of information. They are drawn to gaze, point, voice, rhythm and social feedback. They learn from others with remarkable eagerness. The ape who began to mean more may also have been the ape whose young became more tuned to meaning itself, more ready to treat others as sources of shared knowledge rather than merely bodies to follow. By this point, one can begin to see why the shift matters so much. Once communication becomes richer in intention, culture gains a new engine. Information no longer depends only on direct observation. A person can indicate relevance. A skilled individual can recruit attention to the non-obvious part of a task. A knowledgeable elder can influence behaviour beyond the immediate demonstration. A group can coordinate not only by habit, but by communicated adjustment. This is not full language yet, but it is a world leaning toward language. It is the beginning of symbolic pressure, where signals start to matter, not just because they happen, but because they stand for something more than themselves. Of course, none of this unfolded in a straight line. Different hominin species likely occupied different points along this spectrum. Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, archaic humans, Neanderthals, and early Homo sapiens did not all share identical communicative capacities. Some may have possessed better breath control, some richer gesture, some more refined vocal flexibility, some stronger social teaching traditions. There may have been false starts, branching pathways, and capacities that evolved for one reason before being repurposed for another. Evolution loves recycling. A neural circuit useful for sequencing action may later support sequencing sound. A social sensitivity useful for alliance management may later support conversational inference. A vocal control system shaped partly by emotional communication may later become available for symbolic use. Homo erectus is often especially intriguing in this regard. This species, or cluster of related forms depending on how one draws the boundaries, spread widely, endured for an impressively long time, and showed evidence of significant behavioural change compared with earlier hominins. Larger brains, more advanced tools, probable control of fire in at least some contexts, long-distance movement, and altered life history all suggest a creature living in a more demanding informational world. Many researchers suspect that Homo erectus possessed some sort of proto-language, richer than ape communication but not yet equivalent to modern human speech. One should be careful not to overstate what the evidence can prove, but the possibility is sensible. A species doing that much, across that much geography, likely required communication beyond simple calls and displays. Still, proto-language is a slippery concept. It may have involved strings of meaningful sounds without full grammar. It may have relied heavily on context and gesture. It may have lacked recursion, the embedding of ideas within ideas that gives human language much of its expressive power. But even a limited proto-language would be transformative. A repertoire of stable vocal labels for common tools, foods, places, people, and actions would already expand cultural transmission. Add some simple combinatory ability, and suddenly communication begins to move from fixed signal towards structured meaning. The ape who began to mean more may therefore not have crossed a single boundary, but entered a new kind of arms race, one in which every increase in communicative precision made further increases more useful. This may also have changed emotional life in subtle ways. Once individuals can mean more, they can misunderstand more, persuade more, recruit more, and remember social exchanges with greater complexity. Meaning-rich communication does not only improve cooperation, it complicates it. Intentions become more layered. Reputations matter more. Social bonds can be negotiated with more nuance. Conflict can be managed with greater subtlety or inflamed with greater skill. In other words, the roots of politics may be older than we would like to admit. The path toward speech is not only the path toward poetry and teaching, it is also the path toward promises, excuses, flattery, accusation, and the entire magnificent circus of human social manoeuvring. Even so, the broad trend is clear. At some stage, a communicative system based largely on immediate signals began giving way to one capable of richer shared meaning. That required brains increasingly tuned to intention, bodies increasingly capable of controlled signalling, and social worlds in which the effort was worthwhile. No single fossil will announce the transition with a helpful label. No ancient throat bone will whisper an exact grammar into the ear of science. But the evidence from social complexity, developmental patterns, tool transmission, gesture, vocal learning, and brain evolution all point in the same direction. Our lineage did not simply become louder, it became more meaningful, and once an ape begins to mean more, it is already on a very strange road. Because meaning wants structure. Once signals carry more information, there is pressure to organize them, repeat them, standardize them, distinguish them, and pass them on. A richer system invites memory. Memory invites teaching. Teaching invites convention. Convention invites combination. And combination, once it becomes reliable enough, starts to look an awful lot like the early architecture of language. So the story moves forward not through one dramatic moment of invention, but through many quiet gains in communicative depth, until one day a lineage that began with calls and gestures finds itself poised for something larger, with brains increasingly ready not just to sense the world, but to shape thought about it. Meaning, once it begins to accumulate, puts pressure on the mind that carries it. A call of alarm does not need much architecture behind it. It can be quick, emotional, urgent, and useful all at once. But a system that can hold a sequence, compare possibilities, distinguish roles, remember who did what, and prepare an idea for someone else's understanding asks for something more demanding. It asks for a brain that can do more than react. It asks for a brain that can shape thought. That may be one of the most important changes in the human story. Long before words were written down, long before grammar books arrived to make everyone slightly anxious about where commas belong, the human brain was being remodeled by the pressures of social life, planning, memory, and communication. Speech did not emerge from a mind that was already complete and simply waiting for a better set of vocal cords. It emerged from a brain that had been changing for millions of years, gradually becoming better at holding information in working memory, organizing sequences of action, interpreting the intentions of others, and building increasingly flexible internal representations of the world. In plain terms, our ancestors were not only getting better at making sounds, they were getting better at forming the kinds of thoughts that speech could use. This is where the story becomes especially interesting, because language is not just a communication system laid on top of a normal animal mind. It depends on a very unusual kind of cognition. To speak in anything like a human way, you need to break the world into categories, hold those categories in memory, connect them to sounds, combine them according to patterns, predict how another mind will interpret them, and keep track of relationships across time. That is an enormous amount of work for a lump of tissue floating in salt water inside a skull. The brain does it so casually that we often fail to appreciate the effort involved. A sentence can leave your mouth in 2 seconds. but under the surface it requires a choreography of perception, memory, motor planning, prediction, and control so intricate that if you had to do it consciously, you would never finish ordering tea. The evolution of the human brain, of course, did not happen all at once. Early hominins already had brains capable of tool use, social coordination, and learning. But compared with later humans, those brains were smaller and likely less specialised for the kinds of symbolic and sequential processing that language demands. Over time, especially within the genus Homo, brain size increased, though size alone is never the whole story. A larger brain is not automatically a more linguistic brain, any more than a larger kitchen guarantees a better dinner. What matters is organisation as much as volume. Different regions expand, connect, and cooperate in different ways. The timing of development changes. The balance between sensory, motor, memory, and association areas shifts. And in humans, some of the most significant changes appear to involve exactly those regions linked to planning, abstraction, sequence, and social interpretation. One of the features often discussed in human evolution is the expansion of the frontal lobes, especially the prefrontal cortex. This region is associated with what people loosely call higher cognition, though that phrase can sound as though the rest of the brain is just lounging about without purpose, which is a bit unfair. The prefrontal cortex is deeply involved in working memory, attention control, inhibition, planning, and decision-making. These are all crucial for language. To form even a simple sentence, you have to hold a goal in mind, select relevant information, suppress irrelevant associations, organize a sequence, and monitor the result. If the human brain became increasingly good at such control, that would have laid important groundwork for spoken language. Think about the difference between making a sound because something startled you and saying something because you intend another person to understand a specific relationship. The first can happen almost reflexively. The second requires assembling pieces. You have to decide what matters, how to frame it, in what order to present it, and how much the listener already knows. Human conversation is full of these tiny judgments. We make them constantly. We choose whether to be direct or indirect, whether to name or point, whether to explain from the beginning or assume shared background. We adjust our wording for children, strangers, friends, elders, and people who look like they may be about to misunderstand us in a particularly creative way. All of this draws on executive control and social cognition, both of which depend on brain systems that became more sophisticated over human evolution. Working memory may have been especially important. This is the ability to hold information temporarily in mind and manipulate it. It sounds modest, but it underlies a great deal of what makes language possible. If you are hearing a sentence, you must remember the first part long enough to interpret the rest. If you're producing a sentence, you must keep track of what you have already said and what still needs to be expressed. If you're learning a new communicative pattern, you must store it, compare it, and practice it. A mind with very limited working memory might handle individual signals well enough, but it would struggle with multi-part structure. The gradual strengthening of working memory in our lineage may therefore have been one of the quiet revolutions that made more complex language thinkable. Then there is sequence processing, which turns up everywhere in human cognition. To make a tool, you often need to perform actions in a correct order. To prepare food, the same. To move through social routines, the same again. Language is also sequential, but with a special twist. It is not merely a chain of sounds. It is a chain of sounds arranged so that order affects meaning. The child chased the dog is not the same as the dog chased the child, even though the ingredients are identical, and one imagines the dog probably has opinions on the matter. That sensitivity to ordered structure requires neural machinery capable of organizing and interpreting sequences with precision. Some researchers have suggested that systems originally useful for planning complex actions may have been recruited for language. If the brain can learn ordered motor routines, it may already possess some of the architecture needed for ordered symbolic routines. This is where the so-called Broca's area and surrounding frontal regions often enter the conversation. In modern humans, these areas are strongly linked to speech production and aspects of syntax and sequencing. Damage there can impair the ability to produce fluent, structured speech. For a long time, people treated such areas as though they were neat little language boxes tucked helpfully into the brain like labelled drawers. The reality is more complex. Language depends on broad networks, not isolated islands. Even so, the existence of specialised regions involved in speech planning and structure tells us something important. Human language recruits circuits for sequencing, motor control and symbolic assembly in a deeply integrated way. The brain that learned to shape thought was not simply growing bigger, it was becoming more networked, more predictive, and more capable of turning internal representations into organised output. On the receptive side, regions often associated with comprehension, such as Wernicke's area and related temporal networks, also matter. To understand language, the brain must map sound onto meaning rapidly and flexibly. That means identifying patterns in a stream of noise, separating words, linking them to stored categories, and using context to resolve ambiguity. Human beings are absurdly good at this. We can recognize familiar words under bad acoustic conditions, fill in missing information, and interpret phrases whose literal wording does not fully match their intended meaning. We do this so automatically that it feels effortless, but from an evolutionary perspective, it is a very expensive capability. It implies brains highly tuned for statistical learning, pattern recognition, and predictive interpretation. A system like that does not appear overnight. Another central ingredient is what psychologists sometimes call theory of mind, the ability to infer that other individuals have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives different from one's own. Language does not absolutely require a fully mature theory of mind in every instance, but richer communication becomes much more useful once speakers can model listeners. If I say, "You know the place by the river," I am assuming that you do in fact know it. If I correct myself mid-sentence because I realise you lack some piece of information, that is theory of mind at work. If I tell a story in a way that creates suspense because I understand what you do not yet know, that is even more so. The evolution of social cognition would therefore have directly supported more complex language. A communicative system becomes far more powerful when it is shaped not only by what the speaker wants to express, but by what the speaker believes the listener can understand. There may also be a link between language and mental time travel, the ability to mentally revisit the past and imagine the future. Humans are especially strong in this domain. We reconstruct events, simulate possibilities, rehearse plans, and imagine alternative outcomes with astonishing enthusiasm, especially at 3 a.m. when we should be asleep, and instead decide to relive every awkward conversation from secondary school. This capacity matters for language because speech is not only about the present, it is about displaced reference. Once minds can represent absent situations in detail, language becomes vastly more useful. You can warn, plan, instruct, and speculate. A brain increasingly able to model events beyond the immediate present would therefore create strong selection pressure for a communication system that could externalize those models. Some scientists go further and suggest that language and thought may have co-evolved in a reinforcing cycle. More flexible cognition made richer communication possible, and richer communication then encouraged still more flexible cognition. Once a group begins using symbols or proto-symbols regularly, young brains grow up immersed in a more structured social environment. Learning accelerates, categories become more stable, shared attention is used more often, memory is scaffolded by social input, culture becomes denser. Over time, selection may favour brains that are especially good at acquiring, producing, and using these systems. Language is then not simply a product of human intelligence. It becomes one of the forces that shape what human intelligence is. There is a fascinating developmental clue hidden in the modern human child. Human children are not born speaking, but they arrive strikingly ready for language. They attend to voices, discriminate speech sounds early, babble experimentally, seek shared attention, and learn words at a pace that would be comical if it were not so impressive. This suggests that the human brain comes equipped with strong biases for language learning, not in the sense of knowing a particular language in advance, but in the sense of being specially prepared to detect patterns, segment sound, infer intention, and build structure from use. Evolution has tuned the developing brain toward language. That alone tells us how central speech became to our species. The brain that learned to shape thought also became the brain that expects to be shaped by the thoughts of others. Childhood itself is relevant here. Humans have unusually long developmental periods compared with many other animals. Our brains remain plastic, dependent, and unfinished for a remarkably long time. This is costly, but it offers advantages. A long childhood allows more learning, more socialization, and more cultural transmission. It means the brain is built not only by genes, but by prolonged immersion in a communicative environment. If language is partly cultural and partly biological, then extended development is the perfect meeting place for the two. A slowly maturing brain can be tuned by interaction, practice, feedback, and shared life. That gives culture enormous leverage. The child's brain is not just a private organ. It is a receiving system for a community's accumulated patterns. Social learning more broadly is one of the keys to understanding why human brains changed as they did. Many animals learn from others to some extent. Humans do so obsessively. We watch, imitate, infer, over-imitate, copy methods even when outcomes could be reached more simply, and absorb conventions with remarkable fidelity. This tendency is sometimes so strong that it leads us to preserve rather pointless rituals just because everyone else is doing them, which explains a fair amount of human history and possibly several office traditions. But for language, this fidelity matters. A communication system only becomes stable and cumulative if young learners adopt it reliably enough for it to persist across generations. That requires brains good at pattern extraction, social attention, and convention learning. In other words, language needs not only speakers, but apprentices. The human brain's specialization for fine motor control was also likely crucial. Speech requires precise coordination of lips, tongue, jaw, larynx, and breathing. But before we get too deeply into the anatomy itself, which has its own story to tell, it is worth noting that the brain must control all of it, with incredible timing. Neural circuits for motor planning, sequencing, auditory monitoring, and error correction work together continuously during speech. If you have ever misspoken, corrected yourself, and kept going without much pause, you have experienced this system at work. The brain is not just generating language, it is monitoring and reshaping it in real time. That ability to produce, detect, and adjust structured output may have roots in other skilled behaviors, but in humans it became especially important for speech. Another difference between human cognition and that of our closest relatives lies in symbolic flexibility. Humans are unusually able to let one thing stand for another. A sound can stand for an object. A mark can stand for a sound. A gesture can stand for an action. A story can stand for a rule. A flag can stand for a nation. A wedding ring can stand for a bond. A small icon on a phone can apparently stand for an entire banking system, which remains faintly unsettling if you think about it too long. This symbolic ability is not identical to language, but language depends on it. The brain must tolerate arbitrariness. There is no natural reason why a specific sound should mean tree, water, mother, or fire. It means those things because a community agrees that it does. A brain ready for language must therefore be comfortable with shared convention and stable symbolic mapping. We also cannot ignore the role of auditory processing. Spoken language depends on hearing subtle differences between sounds and grouping them into meaningful categories. Human languages vary tremendously, yet children learn whichever one surrounds them by tuning their perception to relevant distinctions. That means the brain is not merely hearing sound as raw noise, it is sorting, weighting, and categorizing it. The auditory cortex and related temporal systems become specialized through both evolution and experience. A lineage becoming more dependent on vocal communication would benefit greatly from sharper auditory pattern processing. Better listeners make better speakers, and both improve the communicative ecosystem for everyone. By now, it may sound as though speech required nearly every useful feature the human brain has to offer, which is not far from the truth. It draws on memory, attention, motor planning, social reasoning, symbolic mapping, prediction, auditory processing, emotional regulation, and developmental plasticity. This is one reason the emergence of language is so difficult to pin to a single mutation or a single brain area. It was almost certainly a systems-level transformation. Certain genes mattered, certain neural circuits mattered, certain anatomical changes mattered. But what made speech truly possible was the convergence of many capacities into a brain increasingly able to build structured meaning and share it. The FOXP2 gene is often mentioned in popular discussions, and for good reason, though sometimes with more drama than accuracy. It is not a language gene in the sense of a single magical switch that suddenly gave humans speech. Biology is rarely that polite, but FOXP2 is involved in neural development and motor sequencing relevant to speech and language. Mutations in it can disrupt speech production and aspects of language use in modern humans. What makes it interesting in evolutionary discussions is not that it single-handedly invented language, but that it points to the importance of genetic changes affecting the neural circuits underlying vocal control and sequential behavior. In other words, it reminds us that the brain's ability to shape thought into speech depends on biology all the way down, even if no single gene deserves all the applause. There is also evidence from endocranial casts, the impressions of the inside of fossil skulls, suggesting that the brains of later hominins were not only bigger, but differently organized. Interpreting such evidence is tricky, because skull interiors do not hand over tidy labels reading syntax here or symbolism on the left. Even so, changes in cranial shape and reorganization patterns hint that parts of the brain associated with integration and association were becoming more elaborate. Modern humans also show an unusual degree of globularity in the brain case compared with earlier Homo forms, and some researchers think this reflects developmental and organizational shifts relevant to cognition and language. The exact implications are debated, but the broader point remains. The human brain did not simply expand, it reorganized in ways that likely supported more complex internal modeling and communication. All of this leads to a rather profound conclusion. The origin of speech was not merely a matter of finding the right sounds. It was a matter of developing minds capable of turning experience into structured thought. Before you can tell another person what happened, you must be able to represent what happened in a form stable enough to externalize. Before you can explain a plan, you must build the plan mentally. Before you can name a category, you must recognize the category across varied instances. Before you can understand a sentence, you must track relationships among its parts. The brain that learned to shape thought was therefore not just preparing for language, it was preparing for a new style of being human, one in which shared representation would become as important as private perception. And once the mind becomes capable of such shaping, the body begins to matter differently. A brain full of organized intention still needs a way to get that intention out into the world with speed and nuance. Thought may be ready, but it still requires breath, muscle, vibration, and a vocal tract capable of turning neural precision into sound. That means the next stage of the story belongs not only to the mind, but to the throat, the tongue, and the very physical machinery that made speech something more than an inner possibility. If the brain prepared the possibility of language, the body had to make it practical. A mind can organize meaning all it likes, but unless breath can be controlled, unless tissue can vibrate with precision, unless the tongue can reshape airflow in fractions of a second, unless the lips and jaw can cooperate instead of behaving like tired stagehands, speech never leaves the body in a usable form. This is why the evolution of spoken language is not only a story about intelligence, it is also a story about anatomy, about a species whose throat, mouth, and breathing system gradually became capable of a level of vocal control that is almost absurd when you stop to think about it. Human speech feels simple because we do it constantly. In mechanical terms, it is anything but simple. Start with the most basic ingredient, breath. Every spoken sentence begins as controlled airflow from the lungs. Without that stream of air, there is no voice sound to shape. In most animals, breathing is essential, automatic, and only occasionally recruited for communication in relatively fixed ways. In humans, breathing became something more flexible. We still breathe automatically, of course, and thankfully so, because no one wants to remember to inhale manually during sleep. But speech requires us to override the normal rhythm of respiration with extraordinary finesse. We take in air, hold it briefly, then release it in a carefully modulated stream. We lengthen exhalation, vary pressure, pause at meaningful moments, and coordinate all of this with the movements of the larynx, tongue, lips, and jaw. A spoken sentence is not just air leaving the body, it is air being managed. That management matters because speech is built from tiny differences in timing and force. Too much pressure and sounds distort. Too little and they fade. A breath that is fine for walking or resting is not automatically fine for saying a long sentence or sustaining subtle contrast between sounds. Humans are unusually good at this sort of respiratory control, and it may have been one of the major physical steps towards speech. Some researchers have pointed to changes in the thoracic spinal cord and the nerve control of muscles used in breathing as part of this story. The evidence is indirect, as it often is in human evolution, but the logic is strong. A species that can regulate exhaled air with finer control can produce longer, more stable, more varied vocal sequences. That does not create language on its own, but it makes language much easier to build. Once the breath is on its way upward, it reaches the larynx, often called the voice box. This structure sits in the throat and houses the vocal folds, sometimes casually called vocal cords, though they are really folds of tissue rather than tiny instrument strings. As air passes through them, they can vibrate, producing voiced sound. Adjust the tension, position and shape of those folds, and you alter pitch, loudness and voice quality. Many mammals vocalize this way, so the larynx itself is not uniquely human. What matters is how it is controlled and how the rest of the vocal tract shapes the sound that begins there. The larynx is one of the most discussed structures in the evolution of speech, partly because of its position. In adult humans, the larynx sits relatively low in the throat compared with many other mammals. This creates a vocal tract with a particular balance between the horizontal cavity of the mouth and the vertical cavity of the pharynx. That arrangement allows a very wide range of vowels and consonants to be produced. It gives humans exceptional flexibility in shaping sound. But it also comes with a cost. A lower larynx means the pathways for food and air intersect in a riskier way. Humans choke more easily than many other mammals because the anatomy that makes speech efficient also makes swallowing less safely separated from breathing. That trade-off is one of the most striking clues that speech mattered enough in our lineage to shape the body in costly ways. For a long time, people treated the descended larynx as though it were the single decisive answer to human speech, but the truth is more complicated. Some non-human mammals can lower the larynx temporarily, or even maintain relatively low positions for reasons unrelated to language, such as making calls sound larger and more impressive. Deer, for example, can use laryngeal lowering in vocal displays, so a low larynx alone is not the magic key. At the same time, the specific human arrangement of vocal anatomy still matters enormously. What it suggests is not that one anatomical change created speech overnight, but that a cluster of modifications in the head, neck, throat and control systems gradually made a far wider sound space available. That sound space is important because speech depends on articulation as much as voicing. The sound produced at the larynx is only the raw material. It is the tongue, lips, jaw, soft palate and oral cavity that shape this raw signal into distinguishable sounds. Consider the tongue for a moment, a muscle so ordinary seeming that most people think about it only when they bite it or burn it on tea. In speech, the tongue is a marvel of precision. It changes shape rapidly, moves forward and back, rises and lowers, narrows and broadens the vocal tract, and helps create both vowels and many consonants. Human tongues are particularly suited to this versatility because of the proportions and organisation of the oral cavity. We do not merely stick the tongue out to inspect a problem like a perplexed lizard. We use it as a subtle sculptor of airflow. Vowels, which may seem like the softer, simpler part of speech, are actually a brilliant demonstration of this anatomical system at work. When you say different vowels, your vocal folds may continue vibrating in similar ways, but the shape of the vocal tract changes, the tongue shifts, the lips may round or spread, the jaw opens more or less. These adjustments alter the resonant frequencies of the tract, creating acoustic patterns that listeners hear as different vowels. Human beings can produce a very large and stable set of these contrasts. That may not sound dramatic until you consider how much meaning rests on it. Change one vowel and an entirely different word appears. A species that can produce a broad inventory of reliable vowels has already gained a powerful advantage in building a large spoken system. Consonants add another layer of difficulty. Many require brief but exact constrictions of airflow. The lips close and release for sounds like P and B. The tongue tip meets the ridge behind the teeth for sounds like T and D. Air is forced through narrow gaps for fricatives like S and F. The soft palate rises or lowers to separate oral from nasal airflow. Some sounds demand rapid coordination between several parts at once. Speech is full of such micro-events, and they happen with astonishing speed. In ordinary conversation, people may produce 10 or more distinct speech sounds per second, all while planning what to say next, monitoring what they have just said, and trying not to lose the thread of the conversation, because someone nearby has opened a bag of crisps at exactly the wrong moment. The lips deserve more credit than they usually receive. Human lips are unusually nimble, and they are central not only to sound production, but also to visible communication. They help create bilabial sounds such as P, B and M, labiodental sounds such as F and V, and they contribute to vowel shaping through rounding and spreading. In infants, lip control is among the earliest visible features of babbling, which is not surprising. Bilabial sounds are mechanically accessible and common in early speech development. This has sometimes led people to make grand claims about why so many words from other across languages begin with M-like sounds. One should be cautious about sweeping explanations, but the overlap between early articulatory ease and recurrent sound patterns in basic caregiving vocabulary is certainly suggestive. In any case, the point here is that lips are not peripheral decorative accessories added for smiling politely in photographs. They are crucial parts of the articulatory toolkit. The jaw also matters more than one might think. It provides a stable but movable platform that adjusts the openness of the mouth and supports the timing of many articulations. Human speech depends on finely calibrated jaw movements, not dramatic chomping motions. The difference between eating and speaking is a useful reminder that the same anatomy can be adapted to multiple functions, but only with the right control. Our ancestors did not evolve an entirely new mouth for language. They repurposed and refined an older feeding apparatus until it could serve as a speech instrument. That sort of evolutionary recycling is common. Nature is very good at reworking existing parts and rather less interested in designing elegant new systems from scratch. One small bone often receives extraordinary attention in discussions of speech evolution, and for good reason. This is the hyoid bone, a horseshoe-shaped structure in the neck that does not articulate directly with other bones, but anchors muscles of the tongue and larynx. In living humans, it plays an important role in swallowing and speech. Because it is a bone, it has the advantage of occasionally fossilizing, which immediately makes it a celebrity in a field where so much else is soft tissue and therefore lost. The famous Neanderthal hyoid from Kibara Cave in Israel has attracted years of interest because its shape is remarkably similar to that of modern humans. This does not prove that Neanderthals spoke exactly as we do, but it strongly suggests that they had important aspects of the anatomical support for speech. That finding helped weaken the older caricature of Neanderthals as anatomically incapable of anything like modern vocalization. Of course, a hyoid bone on its own cannot tell us everything. A piano key found in the ground would not reveal the whole symphony. The hyoid is part of a larger system, and speech depends on the configuration and control of the entire vocal tract. Still, the fossil evidence matters because it gives us rare physical traces of structures tied to vocal function. When combined with evidence from skull base shape, breathing control, auditory capacities and genetics, it helps build a more complete picture of when different human groups may have possessed the bodily means for speech. Skull shape also enters the story through the flexion of the cranial base, the underside of the skull where the brain case meets the face and throat. In modern humans, the cranial base is more flexed than in many earlier hominins, and some researchers have linked this to the configuration of the vocal tract. A more flexed base may reflect the altered relationship between the oral cavity and the pharynx, contributing to the resonant properties that make a broad vowel system possible. These arguments have to be handled with care because fossil interpretation is always a delicate business, and anatomy does not map neatly onto behaviour. Even so, changes in the face, skull and throat all point to a lineage in which the upper airway was being reorganised in ways compatible with increasingly sophisticated speech. Children provide another clue, because human infants are born with a differently proportioned vocal tract than adults. In early infancy, the larynx sits higher, which helps with suckling and may reduce choking risk. Overdevelopment, the larynx descends. This means that the full adult configuration associated with speech emerges gradually. That developmental pattern is interesting for two reasons. First, it shows that the body trades early feeding safety for later vocal flexibility. Second, it reminds us that speech is not just an anatomical fact, but a developmental one. The growing child's body becomes speech-ready through time, just as the brain does. Evolution has built a life history in which the human organism is first adapted to survive infancy, and then, over years, reshaped into a creature capable of language. Breath control, vocal fold vibration, tongue shaping, lip closure, jaw timing, and pharyngeal resonance all depend on neural control of extraordinary precision. This is why anatomy alone can never solve the mystery. A perfectly shaped vocal tract without the brain to manage it would be useless for language, but it's equally true that a language-ready brain inside a body with rigid, poorly controlled vocal anatomy would remain trapped. Speech is the meeting point of the nervous system and the moving airway. It is embodied thought. That is why the human throat matters so much. It is not just a passage for air and food, it became part of the machinery for culture. The cost of this machinery is worth pausing on again. Human beings are vulnerable to choking because the airway and foodway intersect in a risky arrangement. Other mammals can often separate these functions more safely. We cannot. This is not a trivial inconvenience. It is a real hazard built into our species. The fact that such a compromise persisted suggests that the communicative benefits were substantial. Speech did not emerge because evolution was aiming at conversation as a noble end. It emerged because enough small changes that supported vocal flexibility proved advantageous in the lives our ancestors were living. Over time, the cumulative value of those changes outweighed their costs. That is how evolution often works. It accepts a certain amount of nonsense, provided the overall package reproduces effectively enough. There is also the matter of hearing one's own speech and the speech of others. Anatomy for production is only half the story. The ear and the auditory brain have to keep pace. Humans are especially sensitive to frequency ranges important for speech, and the anatomy of the outer and middle ear in fossil hominins has been studied partly for this reason. Some work suggests that Neanderthals and modern humans shared auditory tuning well suited to speech frequencies, which again points away from the notion that modern spoken capacity appeared in a single abrupt leap. If a species produces subtle articulatory differences, listeners must be able to detect them reliably. A vocal system and an auditory system evolved together, or at least under related pressures. When people imagine the origin of speech, they often picture the first word as though the main event was someone finally attaching a sound to a thing. But the physical story is more basic than that. Before any stable word could work, there had to be a body capable of producing enough distinct sounds, consistently enough for others to learn them. Consistency is crucial. A one-off sound does not become language. A repeatable contrast does. The body had to become not just expressive, but dependable. It had to generate patterns that others could imitate, recognize, and preserve. That is one reason articulation matters so much. It creates a rich inventory of stable differences from a relatively small set of movements. Once those differences are available, culture can begin using them. This is where human speech differs so dramatically from the more fixed vocal systems of many other animals. It is not simply louder, or more emotional, or more frequent. It is combinatorial. A limited set of articulatory gestures can be recombined into thousands of words. Those words can then be combined into sentences with open-ended meanings. But the entire combinatorial enterprise rests on fine physical distinctions in sound. If the body cannot reliably produce and perceive those distinctions, the whole system collapses. So the throat and tongue are not side characters in the story of language. They are among its central engineers. One of the enduring questions is exactly when our ancestors possessed an anatomy close enough to modern humans for fully articulate speech. The safest answer is that no single fossil can settle the issue, but the trend appears to be gradual. Earlier hominins may have had some increased vocal flexibility, without the full modern range. Homo erectus may have possessed parts of the required package, but perhaps not all. Neanderthals appear increasingly likely to have had many of the anatomical prerequisites, especially given the hyoid evidence, auditory findings, and the broader pattern of their behaviour. By the time anatomically modern Homo sapiens appear, the body for speech is clearly present. The question then becomes not whether speech was possible, but how it was being used, and how culturally elaborate it had already become. It is also worth noting that human speech relies on timing that borders on the unbelievable when viewed from the outside. Sounds overlap in fluent conversation. The tongue begins moving toward later sounds before earlier ones are finished. Co-articulation means speech is not a tidy line of separate units, but a flowing coordination of gestures. This makes speech efficient, but it also makes it hard to learn, hard to analyze, and surprisingly easy to underestimate. We listen to a sentence and feel as though the words came out in clean pieces. In reality, the body is conducting a rapid series of compromises and anticipations. The articulators are constantly adjusting. Breath is being metered. Acoustic targets are being approximated in context. It is one of the most complex skilled actions humans perform regularly, and we do it while walking, thinking, gesturing, and looking for our keys. Seen this way, the evolution of speech anatomy is almost as astonishing as the evolution of the brain that controls it. Natural selection reshaped an ape's airway and mouth into an instrument capable of finely segmented, rapidly sequenced, socially learned sound. It modified breathing from a mostly automatic life support rhythm into something that could be deliberately managed for long utterances. It made the tongue more than a tool for swallowing. It made the lips more than a seal. It turned the throat into a resonant chamber whose risks were tolerated because its expressive gains were so large. None of these changes mattered in isolation. Together they made spoken language physically possible. But bodies do not reorganize themselves without deeper causes, and by now the question becomes impossible to avoid. What directed these changes? What underlying biological shifts helped give our species this degree of vocal precision and control? Anatomy tells us what the body could do, but not fully why it developed that way. To understand that part of the story, we have to move one level deeper into the genetic changes that help tune the human system for speech, including one particularly famous gene that has become almost impossible to discuss without someone announcing that scientists have found the language gene, which, to be clear, is not quite how any of this works. When people first began looking for the biological roots of speech, there was always a risk that the story would become far too neat. Humans do love a tidy explanation, especially when it arrives wrapped in a scientific name and sounds as though it has been waiting patiently in a microscope for us to discover it. So when researchers identified a gene called FOXP2 in connection with a rare inherited speech and language disorder, it was tempting to imagine that the mystery had finally been cornered. Here at last was the language gene, a single switch, a molecular key hidden in our cells, just waiting to explain how one ape lineage began to talk. It was an exciting idea, elegant, memorable, and not entirely correct. FOXP2 is important, deeply important, but it is not a secret stash of nouns and verbs tucked into the genome. It does not contain the words for river, fire, mother, mammoth, or please do not poke that with a stick. What it offered instead was something better and more realistic, a way into the machinery, a first clear sign that speech had roots in biology, specific enough to study, yet complex enough to resist fairy tale answers. The discovery became famous because it came from a family, now well known in this field, in which speech and language difficulties appeared across generations in a striking pattern. In 2001, researchers reported that affected members of this large family, often called the KE family, carried a mutation in FOXP2, and that disruption of a single copy of the gene was enough to cause a severe developmental disorder affecting speech and language. That was a major turning point. Before then, people had long suspected that language must have a genetic dimension, but this was one of the first moments when that suspicion was tied to a specific gene with convincing evidence. It mattered not only because the finding was dramatic, but because the nature of the disorder told scientists something crucial. The problem was not simply one of intelligence in a broad sense. Many affected individuals struggled especially with the planning and sequencing of the movements needed for speech, alongside language difficulties. In other words, whatever FOXP2 was doing, it seemed to be tied to the very practical business of turning thought into coordinated vocal action. That distinction is worth sitting with for a moment, because it keeps the whole story grounded. People with FOXP2-related speech and language disorder often show childhood apraxia of speech, which is a problem of speech-motor planning. The issue is not that they have nothing to say. The issue is that the brain has difficulty organising the precise sequences of movement needed to say it clearly and consistently. Sounds may come out distorted, syllables may be hard to arrange, timing and stress patterns can be disrupted, and spoken language is often effortful in a way that most people never have to think about. Language abilities can also be affected more broadly, but the core finding points strongly toward the machinery of sequencing and control. That made FOXP2 fascinating for evolutionary questions, because it suggested that one route into the mystery of speech might not lie in looking for an abstract language organ, but in tracing how evolution improved the neural systems that support learned, rapid, highly organised vocal movements. Speech, after all, is not merely thought made audible, it is thought passing through a very demanding motor skill. FOXP2 itself is not a word library. It is a transcription factor, which means it helps regulate the activity of other genes. This is one reason the early idea of it as a single master language switch was always too simple. A transcription factor is more like a manager than a lone performer. It influences when and where other genes are turned up or down, shaping the development and function of broader biological pathways. In the case of FOXP2, those pathways are especially relevant to brain development, neural connectivity, and motor-related circuits. It is expressed in regions of the developing brain that are important for the learning and control of complex movements, including corticobasal ganglia and cerebellar systems. That matters because speech depends on exactly those sorts of circuits. You must learn sequences, refine them through practice, monitor errors, and adjust rapidly. FOXP2 did not give our ancestors language in the way a magician gives someone a cloak. It likely helped tune the neural networks that made skilled vocal communication more learnable, more reliable, and more precise. This is also why FOXP2 has turned up in research far beyond humans. Scientists became interested in what happens when closely related versions of this gene operate in other animals, especially species with learned vocal behaviours. Songbirds became particularly important here. Their songs are not language, of course, but they are learned vocal sequences requiring practice, auditory feedback, and specialised neural circuits. Changes in FOXP2 activity in songbirds affect song learning and vocal plasticity, which makes them a useful model for thinking about how genes can influence the ability to master complex sound patterns. Mouse studies have added another angle, showing that altered FOXP2 function can affect motor skill learning and the activity of striatal circuits. None of this means birds are composing little prehistoric speeches in the trees, nor that mice are one mutation away from delivering opinions on the weather. What it does mean is that FOXP2 appears to participate in a broader biological theme, the shaping of neural systems involved in learned sequences and sensor and motor control. Human speech seems to have borrowed from that deep biological toolkit and pushed it much further. As interest in FOXP2 grew, researchers also began mapping the wider network around it. Because it is a transcription factor, it influences many downstream targets, and some of those targets have themselves been linked to language-related or neurodevelopmental differences. One example that drew attention is CNTNAP2, identified through work on FOXP2 regulated pathways, and later studied in relation to language and other developmental traits. The larger lesson here is perhaps the most important one. Language does not sit on a single gene. It emerges from networks. FOXP2 became famous because it was the first clear doorway into that landscape, but once scientists stepped through it, they found a whole city of interacting pathways rather than one royal road. Recent reviews of childhood speech disorders make this even clearer. Severe speech disorders such as childhood apraxia of speech are genetically heterogeneous, with many different genes now implicated. FOXP2 remains a landmark because it opened the field, but it is one important actor in a much larger ensemble. If we imagine human speech as a cathedral, FOXP2 helped reveal one of the load-bearing arches, not the entire building. That broader perspective matters especially when the discussion turns from modern clinical genetics to human evolution. Once a gene becomes linked to speech, the next question arrives almost immediately. Was this the genetic change that made us human speakers? It is a dramatic question, and science, annoyingly but correctly, answers it with a slower one. Which changes? In what combinations? In which tissues? At what times in development? Under what social pressures? FOXP2 is highly conserved across many species, meaning its protein sequence changes very little over long evolutionary spans. Humans differ from chimpanzees by just 2 amino acid substitutions in the FOXP2 protein, and those differences attracted enormous interest because they seemed like plausible candidates for human-specific changes. For a while, some researchers argued that this pointed to a relatively recent selective sweep in our lineage, something that had rapidly spread because it was so advantageous. It was a compelling story, and for a time it seemed to fit beautifully with the idea of language as a late explosive revolution. But as often happens in science, the story became more complicated the moment better data arrived. One of the most striking complications came from ancient DNA. In 2007, researchers reported that Neanderthals shared the same 2 derived amino acid changes in FOXP2, that are seen in present-day humans. That result mattered enormously, because it suggested that these particular changes predated the split between the ancestors of modern humans and Neanderthals. In simple terms, they were not some last-minute genetic flourish exclusive to our own species. They were older. Later work also challenged the earlier claim that FOXP2 had undergone a very recent obvious selective sweep, only in modern humans. A 2018 study found no evidence for such recent selection across diverse human populations, arguing that the original signal had likely been misleading. Together, these findings pushed the field away from a dramatic one-gene, one-moment account of language evolution. If Neanderthals shared key FOXP2 protein changes, and if the selective history is more complex than first thought, then speech-related biology was probably accumulating in deeper, older layers of human evolution than the early headlines suggested. That in turn changes how we picture the emergence of speech. Instead of imagining FOXP2 as a genetic lightning strike that suddenly filled Homo sapiens with grammar, it makes more sense to see it as part of a long tuning process affecting neural circuits for vocal control, sequencing, and learning across multiple human lineages. Neanderthals may not have spoken exactly as we do, and the evidence still cannot tell us the texture of their conversations, but the genetics makes it harder to dismiss them as creatures with no serious speech capacity at all. The old contrast between fully verbal modern humans and barely vocal archaic humans has been fading for years, and FOXP2 is one reason why. It does not prove that Neanderthals had the same languages, the same symbolic densities, or the same cultural uses of speech as later Homo sapiens. It does suggest that some of the biological groundwork for complex vocal communication was already present before our species alone occupied the stage. That is a more interesting picture anyway. It replaces miracle with continuity, and continuity is often where evolution does its best work. Even within modern humans, FOXP2 teaches a subtler lesson than the phrase speech gene allows. The gene is involved in development, and development is not a simple script. Genes do not sit in cells like tiny librarians handing out sentences. They regulate processes, interact with other genes, respond to timing, and help build tissues that are then shaped further by experience. In the case of speech, that means FOXP2 is part of constructing a brain capable of learning and executing vocal patterns, but actual language still depends on social life, hearing, practice, feedback, and culture. A child does not develop speech from FOXP2 alone, any more than a piano develops music from wood alone. There must be a player, a community, a tradition, a period of learning, and a nervous system ready to improve through use. This is one reason modern genomic work on speech and language has become increasingly cautious and increasingly rich. Researchers are now tracing constellations of genes, neural pathways, and developmental trajectories, rather than hunting for one mythic answer. It turns out speech, like most things worth admiring, was assembled by many hands, and there is something rather beautiful in that. The genetic story of language does not shrink the wonder of speech, it deepens it. FOXP2 matters precisely because it shows that language is grounded in flesh and time, in inheritance and development, in circuits that must be built before they can be used. Yet it also reminds us that genes prepare possibilities rather than dictating finished outcomes. Our ancestors were not handed a complete language by a fortunate mutation. They inherited bodies and brains with shifting potentials. Some changes improved motor sequencing, some altered development in the basal ganglia and related circuits, some affected broader networks for learning and plasticity. These changes accumulated within social groups where communication had growing value, where children learned from elders, where cooperation rewarded clarity, and where the ability to shape sound more reliably could preserve more knowledge across generations. FOXP2 was part of that story because it helped make a certain kind of nervous system possible, one better suited to mastering articulate vocal behaviour than what came before. It is also worth noting that the modern clinical evidence keeps the story honest. When FOXP2 is disrupted, speech can become extraordinarily hard work, and that tells us something profound about what ordinary speech actually is. The rest of us speak so effortlessly that we hardly notice the underlying achievement. We pronounce long strings of sounds, shift stress and rhythm, coordinate breathing and articulation, recover from slips, and adapt to context in real time. FOXP2 related disorders reveal just how fragile that orchestration can be when one piece of the developmental program is disturbed. They do not reduce language to one gene. They illuminate how much intricate biology lies beneath what feels like everyday ease. Every spoken sentence is supported by developmental pathways that had to be assembled correctly enough, early enough, and robustly enough for fluent speech to emerge. When that assembly is altered, the hidden complexity becomes visible. Science often advances by studying what happens when a system breaks, and in this case the break taught us a great deal about how speech is built. So if we ask whether FOXP2 helped unlock a voice, the fairest answer is yes, but not by itself, and not in the romantic way the phrase may suggest. It did not place language whole into human mouths. It helped shape the neural conditions under which speech could become more precise, more learnable, and more dependable. It opened a window onto the biology of vocal control. It linked genetics to a distinctly human difficulty with sequencing speech movements. It pointed researchers toward networks of development rather than isolated miracle traits. It also forced a humbling revision of the idea that modern speech must have appeared in one sudden burst unique to our species. The deeper the evidence became, the more the story widened. Genes mattered. Development mattered. Ancient lineages mattered. The social world in which sounds were used mattered. And once all of that was in place, what still remained was the next great step. Not just making better sounds, but turning those sounds into stable symbols that could travel from one mind to another and mean the same thing often enough to build a culture on top of them. A voice, even a well-controlled one, is not yet language. It is only possibility. Breath can be shaped, sounds can be varied, the throat can cooperate, the tongue can move with astonishing speed, the brain can organize intention, and genes can help build the circuitry for all of it. But none of that by itself creates meaning that lasts beyond the moment. A cry can reveal fear. A grunt can show effort. A soothing murmur can calm a child. Useful, certainly. Powerful, absolutely. But language begins to look like language only when sounds stop being tied so tightly to immediate emotion and start standing in for things, actions, qualities, people, places, and ideas. That is the turning point we need now, not the moment the human body learned to make richer sounds, but the moment sounds became symbols. This may be one of the most unusual things our species ever did. After all, there is nothing naturally tree-like about the word tree. Nothing in the sound itself contains bark, leaves, shade, or roots. The word does not resemble the object. It does not smell like wood or cast a shadow. It is simply a pattern of sound that a community has agreed will stand for a particular kind of thing. The same is true across languages. One group says one sound, another group says a different sound, and both manage perfectly well to refer to the same kind of object. That is what makes symbols so strange and so useful. Their power does not come from resemblance. It comes from shared agreement. Once a group can do that reliably, the world changes. You no longer need the thing itself present in order to refer to it. You do not need to point at a river every time you want to mention water. You do not need a predator standing in front of everyone to communicate that one was seen earlier. You do not need a tool in your hand to tell someone to bring it. This is where communication begins to pull free from the immediate moment. A sound becomes a handle for an absent reality, and once that happens, knowledge can travel much farther than sight. Getting there, though, was probably not simple. It is tempting to imagine the first word as some dramatic prehistoric event, perhaps involving an especially bright ancestor, pointing toward a dangerous animal and making a noise so meaningful that everyone around them suddenly gasped and invented vocabulary. Real life was almost certainly less theatrical. Symbolic sound likely emerged gradually through repetition, habit, social pressure, and the steady advantage of being able to reuse certain vocal patterns in stable ways. A sound associated again and again with a particular food source might slowly become conventional. A repeated call used during one kind of task might narrow in meaning and become more specific. A vocal pattern once tied loosely to an action might grow more fixed until it begins to function almost like a label. In other words, sounds may have become symbols not through one grand leap, but through thousands of small acts of shared understanding. A group member uses a particular sound while reaching for a stone core. Others begin to associate that sound with the object or the action. The sound is used again and again in similar contexts. Eventually, it no longer depends entirely on the object being visible. Someone can produce the sound before the tool is picked up, and others understand what is meant. That is already a significant advance. A signal is no longer merely reacting to the world. It is referring to it. Reference in this sense may have begun with practical life. Food, water, danger, movement, tools, kin, shelter, fire. These are the things that matter first in survival. One does not need abstract philosophy to begin building symbolic communication. One needs regular problems and repeated situations. If a group lives in a world where some things matter over and over again, then stable sounds for those things become useful. That usefulness is what matters. A symbol survives because it earns its keep. If a consistent sound helps gather food more efficiently, warn children more quickly, coordinate movement more smoothly, or preserve a tool-making practice more reliably, then it gains a place in the group's behaviour. But symbols do more than label objects. They also label actions. Consider the difference between being able to indicate a spear and being able to indicate throw, bring, wait, cut, carry, follow, or stop. These action-related meanings are vital because human life is organised not just around things, but around what is done with them. A world of pure naming would be useful, but limited. The real power of symbolic communication expands once a group can stabilise sounds not only for entities, but for events and relations. A sound for stone helps. A sound for strike helps more. A sound that distinguishes strike now from strike later, or strike there from strike here, helps still more. The path toward full language likely depended on this gradual thickening of the symbolic web. Children may once again have played a major role in pushing this process forward. Human infants and young children are brilliant pattern detectors. They listen, compare, imitate, simplify, exaggerate, and repeat. They're also surprisingly good at treating sounds as socially meaningful once their environment supports it. A child hearing the same vocal pattern used in connection with the same object over and over is likely to form an association. That is true today, and it was likely true long before modern languages took their current shapes. Once adults became even slightly more regular in how they paired sounds with things, children may have helped stabilise the system simply by learning and reproducing it. Cultural systems often become more fixed because the young absorb them eagerly. Language, perhaps more than anything else, depends on that. There is also a social side to symbols that makes them different from raw signals. Signals can often be understood in the moment because they are tied to emotion or context. A scream does not need much explanation, but a symbol only works if others already know the convention. This means symbolic communication requires shared membership. It depends on a community. A private symbol is not very useful unless someone else learns it. That makes symbols inherently social in a way that simple vocal reactions are not. When sounds became symbols, communication was no longer just about expression. It became about tradition. A group had to maintain a system together. That system could then begin accumulating over generations. This is the point where language begins to outgrow individual biology. Once sounds function as symbols, they can be preserved culturally. A particular vocal label can survive the death of the person who first used it. Another person can learn it, teach it, modify it slightly, and pass it on. Culture begins to ride on top of the body. Evolution built the hardware, certainly, but symbolic communication gave humans something more than hardware. It gave them inheritance through learning. A child no longer had to rediscover meanings from scratch. They could enter a world already partly labelled by others, and once the world is labelled, thought itself may begin to change. This is always a delicate topic because people sometimes overstate it and make language sound like the sole creator of human thought, which is too much. Our ancestors thought before full language. They planned, remembered, feared, desired, recognized patterns, and learned from one another. But symbolic language changes the texture of thought because it provides stable handles for categories. A repeated sound can bundle many experiences together. Different trees can be gathered under one label. Different dangerous creatures might be distinguished by separate ones. Different social roles can become more clearly marked. Categories become easier to store, compare, and discuss once they can be named. That in turn allows another crucial development: the sharing of categories that are not immediately obvious. Suppose one group member has learned through experience that a certain kind of stoneflake's better than another, or that a certain patch of berries is safe only in one part of the season, or that a certain animal track means the herd passed recently rather than yesterday. Without symbols, teaching such distinctions is possible but slower and more limited. With symbols, those distinctions can be highlighted, repeated, corrected, and remembered. Language begins by naming things, but it quickly starts sorting the world. Some of the earlier symbolic sounds may have been more flexible than modern words, yet less precise than modern language. Researchers sometimes use terms like proto-word or proto-language to describe this sort of intermediate stage. The idea is not that early humans spoke in fully grammatical sentences one day after being entirely non-verbal the day before. Rather, they may have built communicative systems with stable, meaningful sounds but limited syntax. Think of a repertoire of vocal symbols that could be combined loosely, often relying heavily on gesture, shared context, and tone. Fire there. You come. Food near water. Not necessarily in those exact forms, of course, but something closer to a basic symbolic toolkit than to modern language with all its embedded clauses, tense systems, and opportunities for misunderstandings over whether one meant literally or figuratively. Such a system would already be transformative. Even a modest symbolic vocabulary dramatically expands what a group can do. It allows repeated teaching. It helps memory. It improves coordination. It supports displaced reference. It may even allow early forms of social narrative, simple recounting of who went where, what happened, and what should be done next. You do not need epic poetry to begin reshaping human life. A few dozen stable symbols, used well, could already alter survival. There is also the possibility that sound symbolism played some role in the earlier stages. Not all words in human languages are fully arbitrary. Some sounds seem intuitively more suited to certain meanings than others. Across languages, there are patterns in which particular vowel or consonant shapes feel more associated with smallness, largeness, sharpness, softness, or suddenness. This does not mean language is mostly imitative. It plainly is not. But in the earliest development of symbolic systems, sounds that carried some natural expressive hint may have been easier to stabilize. A sharp, abrupt sound might work well for something sudden or dangerous. A softer, prolonged one might suit soothing or slow movement. Over time, once symbolic conventions were established, language could move much farther into arbitrariness. But a small foothold in sound symbolism may have helped the process begin. Then again, arbitrariness is one of the greatest strengths language ever acquired. If every word had to resemble what it meant, communication would stay tied to the kinds of things that can be mimicked acoustically. That would be a very poor system for talking about ideas, relationships, absent people, ownership, memory, or anything else that does not make a convenient noise. Arbitrary symbols are efficient because they are free. A community can use whatever sound patterns are easiest or most stable for it, regardless of resemblance. This lets vocabulary grow far beyond the limits of imitation. Once that freedom is accepted socially, the symbolic universe can expand almost without limit. Expansion, however, creates another problem. The more symbols a group has, the more it must keep them distinct. A handful of labels is manageable. Hundreds require more careful sound structure. Thousands require real organisation. This is where the body and brain from the earlier parts of the story return with full force. Rich symbolic systems demand reliable articulatory contrast, good auditory discrimination, memory for forms, and increasingly fine control over sound combinations. In a way, as soon as sounds became symbols, they began putting pressure on the rest of the system to become more language-like. Once meaning depends on small acoustic differences, those differences must be preserved. Once a community relies on shared labels, learners must acquire them accurately enough. The whole system becomes self-reinforcing. At this point, one can see why naming alone was not the end of the story. If a group has symbols but no good way to combine them, communication remains limited. You can name food, fire, child, river, danger, and spear, but if you cannot indicate relationships among them, the expressive ceiling arrives quickly. Spear, child, river, danger is not much help unless everyone already knows exactly what situation you mean, and even then it leaves far too much room for unfortunate interpretation. Once symbols exist, the next major step is learning how to arrange them. That may have begun very simply, through preferred orders, repeated patterns, and fixed pairings. Perhaps a sound for an action tended to follow the sound for an object. Perhaps one sound consistently marked a request, another a warning, another a social role. Repetition would slowly turn these habits into expectations. This likely happened because human social life demanded more than labels. It demanded structured exchange. Imagine trying to coordinate even a modest group task without some way to indicate who is doing what should happen first, what belongs to whom, where something is located, or whether a statement refers to now, before, or soon. Much of this can be carried by context, gesture, and shared routine, but only up to a point. The growth of symbolic sound would naturally create pressure for more regular combinations, and once combinations become regular, language starts to feel less like a bag of labels and more like a system. Still, even before full grammatical structure emerged, symbolism itself changed human culture in lasting ways. It allowed names. Names are no small thing. To name another person is to mark them as socially stable in memory. It lets absent individuals be discussed, alliances be tracked, kinship be clarified, blame be assigned, praise be directed, and stories be anchored. A named world is a more organised world. Names for places matter too. A river bend, a sheltering grove, a hunting ground, a dangerous slope once named, become easier to preserve in group memory. The landscape itself becomes more mentally structured. This is one of a language's quiet revolutions. It does not merely describe the world, it partitions it into shared mental landmarks. Symbols also make ritual more durable. A repeated vocal pattern linked to an event, season, group identity, or social act can persist with unusual stability. Even before elaborate myths or formal religion, symbolic sounds may have supported repeated communal practices. A chant-like sequence associated with gathering, mourning, preparing, or celebrating could reinforce shared behaviour and memory. Humans are rhythmic creatures, and sound binds groups efficiently. Once specific sounds acquire specific communal meanings, they can outlast the occasion that first shaped them. Culture begins to sediment. There is something else that happens when sounds become symbols. Error becomes possible in a new way. A cry of fear can be false, certainly, but a symbol can be used correctly, incorrectly, vaguely, ironically, misleadingly, or creatively. This is another mark of the shift. Language is powerful partly because it allows people to say more than the immediate environment guarantees. That creates possibility and trouble in equal measure. Someone can warn of danger not present, promise food not yet found, claim skill not actually possessed, or tell a story that reshapes what others believe. The first symbols did not only make cooperation easier, they also opened the door to persuasion, deception, planning, and imagination. Human social life became richer and more complicated at exactly the same time. Imagination especially may owe much to this transition. Once sounds can stand for absent realities, they can also stand for possible realities. A hunt that has not happened yet can be discussed. A route can be proposed. A future season can be anticipated. A child can be warned about a place they have never seen. Symbolic sound lets the future enter the present socially. This may be one of the deepest consequences of language. It allows a group to coordinate around events not yet real. Much of civilization eventually grows from that one trick, and it is worth saying again that none of this required modern language to appear fully formed in an instant. The process could have been slow, uneven, and spread across many generations. One community might stabilize more labels than another. One lineage might become better at combining them. Children might regularize messy adult systems. Social innovations might favor richer communication in one environment and simpler systems in another. Over long periods, the most useful patterns would persist. Symbols would become denser. Combinations would become more reliable. Meanings would become less dependent on immediate context. At some stage, though, the balance tipped. Sounds were no longer merely expressive additions to social life. They had become the primary means by which complex human groups carried knowledge from one mind to another. Once that happened, culture could accumulate faster. Skills could be explained with greater precision. Social rules could be transmitted more widely. Memories could be retold rather than merely reenacted. The dead could affect the living through spoken recollection. The absent could matter through report. The possible could enter decision-making through discussion. This was not yet the world of writing, law codes, or formal storytelling as we know it. But it was the world in which those things became possible. And perhaps the most remarkable thing of all is how ordinary it must have felt once it began working well. A new sound catches on. A child learns it. An elder repeats it. A group member uses it to warn, ask, recall, or guide. Another understands. The exchange succeeds. Nothing glows, no cosmic bell rings, yet a threshold has been crossed. Meaning has escaped the body and taken on a shared acoustic form stable enough to survive its speaker. That is no small achievement for a primate standing in a windy landscape, with limited daylight and many practical concerns. From there, the next development almost announces itself. Once symbols exist and begin to combine, people do more than label their world. They begin to use sound to coordinate daily life in richer, more social and more continuous ways. Language moves from isolated meaning to interaction. It enters shared labour, shared care, shared movement, and eventually the long evenings when people are gathered close enough to exchange more than warnings and requests. And somewhere in those repeated human settings, speech stops being only a tool for naming things and becomes the fabric of conversation itself. Once sounds had become symbols, speech no longer needed to wait for emergency, hunger, or immediate action. It could begin filling the spaces in between, and that may be where one of the biggest changes in human life took place. Not in the moment of danger, not in the rush of the hunt, not while crossing open ground with everyone focused on staying alive, but later, when the urgent work of the day had eased, when food was being shared, tools were being checked, children were close, and light from a controlled fire pushed back the dark just enough to let people remain together a little longer than the sun alone would have allowed. That is where the idea of the first conversations around the fire becomes so important. Not because we can prove exactly what was said, and certainly not because anyone left us a neat transcript scratched into a cave wall reading, "Evening discussion, 3 points of business, 1 complaint about smoke direction." We have nothing so convenient. but we do have reason to think that fire changed the rhythm of human social life, and with it, the opportunities for language to become more continuous, more detailed, and more woven into everyday existence. Fire is easy to romanticize, and perhaps that is unavoidable. It is warm, bright, useful, dangerous, mesmerizing, and one of those rare things that manages to look both practical and slightly magical at the same time. For early humans, though, it was first and foremost a tool. It gave heat, protection, light, and eventually helped with cooking, landscape management, and material processing. Controlled fire altered food, extended waking time, changed social spacing, and reduced some of the risks of darkness. That alone would make it one of the great turning points in human history. But for the story of speech, its social effects may have mattered just as much as its physical ones. Before regular fire use, the human day was governed more tightly by daylight. Activity rose and fell with the sun. Night imposed limits. Once darkness settled, visibility dropped. Predators became a greater concern. Temperatures could fall sharply, and social activity likely narrowed. Fire changed that. A group gathered around a protected flame had something rare in the natural world. Usable time after dark. Not infinite time, not effortless comfort, but enough shared evening time to matter. People could remain awake together in relative safety. They could prepare food, inspect wounds, tend children, repair tools, watch others, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes, communicate in a setting less dominated by immediate movement and task pressure. That shift in timing matters more than it may seem at first. Language grows best not only in moments of necessity, but in moments of shared attention. A person trying to shout a warning while sprinting away from danger is using speech at one end of its range. A person sitting near others, with hands partly free and attention available, is using it at another. Around a fire, communication could become less urgent and more extended. There was room for explanation, for repeated instruction, for commentary, for social checking, and eventually for something that begins to look a great deal like conversation rather than mere signalling. Even today, conversation changes with setting. People talk differently while crossing a street than they do over a meal. The body relaxes, turn-taking becomes easier, and thought has more time to unfold. One can imagine something similar, in a simpler but still powerful form, among early humans. During the day, a great deal of communication would still have been practical, compressed, and supported heavily by shared routines. But in the evening, a fire could gather the group into a smaller social field. Everyone faced roughly toward the same place. The glow made faces visible. Gesture remained usable. Tone of voice could soften. Repetition became less costly. A younger group member could listen, while older individuals exchanged information. The entire structure of social learning may have deepened in those hours. Cooking deserves a place here as well, even if the exact timing and extent of early cooking remain debated. Once food is brought to fire, it changes. Meat softens, some toxins reduce, starches become more digestible. Chewing time can drop, and meals may become more centralized. Richard Wrangham and others have argued that cooking had profound effects on human evolution, though the details are still discussed vigorously. What matters for this chapter is that fire likely changed not just what humans ate, but how they ate. A cooked meal encourages waiting, watching, and gathering in a way that raw foraging does not always require. If food preparation became more cooperative and more centered on a shared heat source, then it also became a setting in which communication could flourish. Waiting for food is not wasted time in a social species. It is prime time for teaching, observing, joking, correcting, and recalling who forgot to turn the tubers or who insisted that this particular thing was definitely edible. harvard.edu, sapiens.org. One of the most interesting ideas about fire and language is that evening, social life may have shifted communication from the purely practical toward the informational and social. During a hunt, a message may need to be brief and tied to immediate action. Around a fire, people can revisit events. They can compare experiences. They can name individuals not present in the immediate action. They can discuss a place visited earlier in the day or mention a route planned for tomorrow. This is where displaced reference, one of language's great powers, becomes especially useful. Fire may not have created displaced reference, but it almost certainly gave it better working conditions. A group sitting together after the day's tasks has reasons to talk about what happened elsewhere and what should happen next. And once you can do that, conversation stops being merely a way to manage the present. It becomes a way to preserve the recent past and shape the near future. A person can recount where game tracks were seen. Another can describe which plants were found near the marsh. A third can warn that one path is unsafe after heavy rain. An elder can remind younger members how a certain mistake led to injury last season. These are not yet myths in the grand sense, perhaps, but they are already narrative in miniature. Human groups do not need full literature to begin living through shared retellings. A few spoken sequences about who went, what happened, what to avoid, and what to do tomorrow already transform the group's collective intelligence. That phrase, collective intelligence, may sound slightly grand for a band of early humans sitting near a fire, but it is exactly the right idea. Speech lets a group become smarter than any one person in it. Around a fire, that process becomes visible. One individual contributes information from one part of the landscape, another adds a different observation, another corrects or confirms, another demonstrates a tool repair while speaking, and someone younger absorbs all of it. The fire does not merely light faces, it lights a zone in which knowledge can accumulate socially. In daytime movement, information is often scattered across people. In evening gathering, it can be pooled. This pooling may have mattered immensely for child learning. Human children spend years mastering the skills their communities require. They need to learn where to go, what to fear, what to eat, how to carry, how to cut, how to identify social expectations, and how to behave in situations they have not yet encountered on their own. Around a fire, children could listen without being the main participants. They could watch adults use speech for more than command or warning. They could hear names repeated, places referred to, events retold, plans discussed, and perhaps even disagreements worked through. This is a very different linguistic environment from one dominated solely by immediate activity. It allows language to be overheard, not just directed. An overheard language is one of the great engines of human learning. It may also have helped stabilize the sound system itself. Repetition in relaxed social settings gives children more chances to hear the same words, phrases, and vocal patterns across multiple contexts. If one adult calls a place by one sound and another repeats it, the pattern strengthens. If a child attempts it and is corrected or simply hears it again more clearly, the form becomes easier to learn. In this way, firelit social time may have contributed not just to the amount of communication, but to its consistency. Language is easier to preserve when it is used often in contexts that allow listening rather than only reacting. And then there is the social content that may have bloomed in those evening hours. Humans do not speak only to exchange practical information. We speak to maintain relationships, negotiate status, reassure, flatter, tease, test loyalties, and manage tensions without constant physical confrontation. Some theorists have even argued that gossip, broadly defined as social talk about absent others and ongoing relationships, may have been one of language's major social uses. The idea sounds faintly mischievous, but it has real force. In larger, more complex groups, maintaining alliances and understanding who stands with whom becomes extremely important. Speech allows one person to update another about social reality, without needing the entire group physically present. Around the fire, where people are gathered and reflecting on the day, this sort of talk may have become especially common. That does not mean prehistoric evenings were one long stream of muttered commentary about who was pulling their weight and who was making suspicious decisions with the food supply, though one suspects some of that certainly occurred. It means that language around the fire may have helped groups maintain cohesion by constantly refreshing shared social knowledge. Who is reliable? Who is injured? who quarrelled, who succeeded, who needs help tomorrow. These are the kinds of things that help a group function. Speech turns social complexity into something manageable. Fire gave that speech a setting. It is also possible that this setting encouraged more expressive uses of language. Once conversation is no longer limited to the purely necessary, people begin to vary how they speak. Emphasis, rhythm, imitation, play, and exaggeration all become more attractive. Children are especially responsive to this, but adults use it too. One can imagine early storytelling beginning in this zone, not yet as full mythic tradition, but as animated retelling. Someone imitates the movement of an animal. Someone exaggerates the panic of a near accident. Someone performs another person's mistake to general amusement. These are small things, but culturally they matter. Language becomes more memorable when it becomes performative. The first conversations around the fire may have contained the earlier seeds of drama, humour, and collective memory. Humour in particular deserves a brief mention because it depends on shared expectations and shared knowledge. You cannot really joke unless others can follow a setup, detect a mismatch, or recognise an exaggerated truth. That implies language already doing subtle work. One does not need puns and satire to begin with, but even playful imitation or harmless teasing is a sign that speech has moved beyond pure utility. Around a fire, with the pressure of the immediate day reduced, a group may have had the first real space for this sort of vocal play. And vocal play matters. It trains timing, turn-taking, memory and social sensitivity, all of which support more mature language use. Another important effect of fire is simply that it narrows space. In daylight, a group may be spread across a broader area while gathering, carrying and moving. Around a fire, people cluster. Proximity changes communication. Softer sounds become useful. Quiet speech becomes possible. Not every utterance needs to be projected over distance or tied to movement. This may have helped language diversify in tone and function. A loud warning call serves one purpose. A low directed utterance serves another. Conversation thrives on this lower range, where speech can become more nuanced and less energetically costly. It is not hard to imagine how this would reward increasingly fine control of vocal production. Of course, we have to be honest about the limits of what we can know. Fire use itself has a complex archaeological record. There are claims and counterclaims, likely early evidence, stronger later evidence, and many debates over whether a given trace reflects natural wildfire, opportunistic use, or sustained control by hominins. Clear evidence for habitual fire use becomes much more common later than the earliest possible traces. Sites such as Wonderwork Cave in South Africa provide evidence interpreted by many researchers as controlled fire use around 1 million years ago, while other studies place more regular, widespread use later in the Middle Pleistocene. This uncertainty matters because we should not pretend the chronology is tidier than it is. Still, even if the timing varied by region and lineage, the broader point remains strong. Once humans regularly controlled fire, evening social life changed, and language would almost certainly have changed with it. Pennis.org, nature.com. There is a subtle psychological effect here too. Fire holds attention. People watch it. Their faces orient toward it. Its movements are variable enough to remain interesting and stable enough to remain calming. In a group setting, that shared visual focus may help maintain collective attention, while language flows around it. Modern campfires still do this. People gather, talk more freely, remember things, tell stories, lapse into silence, then pick up the thread again. It is one of those ancient technologies whose social effects remain legible. The prehistoric fire was not just a heat source, it was a centre of gravity for human attention. This may have encouraged longer chains of speech. During active movement, speech tends to be short, tied to action, and frequently interrupted. Seated social life permits extended turns. One person can speak while others listen. Another can respond at length. That shift matters enormously for the growth of narrative. Narrative needs continuity. It needs room for sequence. First this, then this happened, and that is why we should not go back there until the rains stop. Without settings that support extended listening, such forms struggle to stabilize. Around the fire, for perhaps the first time on a regular basis, the human voice may have found a reliable audience, and an audience changes the speaker. Once a person can expect others to listen beyond the immediate command or warning, speech becomes something that can be shaped for effect. You can emphasize one part, pause before another, repeat an important detail, correct yourself, perform a role, or instruct more carefully. In this way, fire may have helped make language not only more common, but more crafted. The difference between saying enough and saying it well may have begun here, in the social luxury of having a few extra moments and a listening group. One should also consider the emotional function of evening speech. Darkness changes mood. Fatigue changes mood. So does the aftermath of risk. A group that has spent the day moving through uncertain conditions may need more than information when it gathers. It may need reassurance. It may need cohesion. Speech can do that. A calm voice can settle a frightened child. A repeated phrase can stabilize a routine. Shared sounds can mark safety. We often think of language as analytical, but much of its deepest work is emotional and relational. The first conversations around the fire were likely not only about knowledge, they were also about comfort. The same vocal system that carried warnings could carry belonging. That belonging is no small matter in human evolution. We're a species that survives through cooperation. Infants are dependent. Food is often shared. Knowledge is distributed. Injury does not always mean abandonment. Language supports this social structure by making membership audible. A person who speaks with the group belongs to the group in a particularly powerful way. Their knowledge is accessible, their experiences are shareable, their intentions can be negotiated, their memory can serve others. Around the fire, speech may have become one of the ways a group recognized itself as a group. This is perhaps why the image of the fire is so enduring in the study of human origins. It sits at the intersection of body, brain, culture, and society. Fire altered diet and day length, but it also altered the social architecture in which language lived. It created repeated spaces for shared attention, extended turn-taking, teaching, gossip, comfort, and early narrative. It allowed words to do more than point and warn. It let them circulate through the group and settle into memory. A practical technology became a social one, and then a linguistic one. From there, speech could begin doing something even larger. Once people repeatedly gathered to talk, remember, imitate, explain and recount, language no longer served only immediate coordination. It started preserving the group itself. Information became tradition. Repeated stories became lessons. Names became lineage. Shared phrases became markers of belonging. The evening voice by the fire was already preparing the next great turn, the one in which language would begin to build memory beyond one lifetime, connect living people to the dead, and turn groups of related individuals into something much more durable than a temporary band moving through the dark. Once speech became reliable enough to carry more than immediate warnings and practical instructions, it began doing something even more powerful. It started storing people inside one another. Not physically, thankfully, because that would be distressing and impractical, but mentally. A person no longer had to rely only on what they themselves had seen, touched, or survived. They could carry the experience of others in spoken form. A child could know about a dangerous valley before ever stepping near it. A young hunter could learn where herds moved in the dry season from someone too old to follow them anymore. A grieving relative could hear the name of the dead spoken again and again, until that person remained present in the life of the group, even after the body was gone. Language made memory portable, and once memory became portable, human groups changed in scale and character. Before that shift, knowledge was much harder to preserve. Skills could be watched, habits copied, places revisited, but most of what mattered lived in bodies, routines, and repeated direct experience. A person knew what they had done, a group knew what it was used to doing. If something unexpected happened, it might be learned, but the lesson could be fragile unless the event was repeated often enough to settle into shared behaviour. Spoken language changes this because it lets experience be retold. Retelling matters. It gives an event more than one life. It moves knowledge out of the moment of danger or success and into the future. This is where memory begins to take on a social form. Humans always had memory in the biological sense. Brains stored experience long before language. But spoken language allows individual memory to be pooled, compared, corrected, reinforced, and organised across many people. Instead of 10 individuals each knowing only their own experiences, a group with language can begin building a rough common record. Not perfect, certainly. Human memory is famously selective, reconstructive, and open to dramatic revision, especially when ego becomes involved. But imperfect shared memory is still far more powerful than isolated memory. One person remembers where water lasted longest in the last dry season. Another remembers which plants made someone ill. Another remembers the route that avoided a predator den. Spoken together, these memories become group intelligence. This may be one of language's greatest evolutionary advantages, and it is easy to overlook because it feels so normal. Most of us live inside this system every day. We know things we never discovered personally. We know about distant places, old disasters, remedies, customs, kin relations, recipes and warnings because other people told us. In literate societies, writing amplifies this effect enormously. But the principle is older than writing by a very long margin. Spoken language was already doing this work in prehistory. It allowed the past to remain active. It let yesterday advise today. That is also why language is so closely tied to teaching. Once memory can be voiced, it can be shaped for instruction. A dangerous event can be turned into a caution. A successful technique can become a lesson. A repeated pattern in nature can become a rule of thumb. An elder no longer has to wait for a younger person to make exactly the same mistake in order to learn from it. The mistake can be narrated, and if the narration is memorable enough, it can continue serving the group long after the original speaker is gone. This is where knowledge begins to accumulate more rapidly. Culture gains a memory system outside the individual body. But memory does not stay purely practical for very long. Humans are not content to preserve only the useful mechanics of life. We also preserve identity, belonging, and explanation. Once a group can speak about its past, it can begin telling itself who it is. That is where myth enters the picture, though the word myth sometimes causes confusion because people hear it and think only of falsehood. In the deeper anthropological sense, myth is not merely something untrue. It is a story a group uses to organize meaning. It explains origins, relationships, values, obligations, dangers, boundaries, and the structure of the world as the group understands it. A myth may contain historical fragments, imagination, cosmology, moral instruction, and memory all layered together. It is not just entertainment, though it may entertain. It is social architecture built from speech. Before writing, myths had to live in memory, and that means language had to do two jobs at once. It had to preserve information, and it had to preserve it in a form memorable enough to survive repeated retelling. This may help explain why oral traditions so often use rhythm, repetition, parallel structure, vivid imagery, stock phrases, and patterned sequencing. These are not decorative extras, they are technologies of memory. If a story has to survive in human minds and pass accurately enough across generations, it benefits from structure that helps recall. Even practical knowledge often becomes easier to remember when wrapped in narrative or repetition. A simple instruction can be forgotten. A striking story about what happened when the instruction was ignored tends to linger. That may have begun in very modest ways. A dangerous river crossing becomes a repeated tale. A particularly harsh season becomes a remembered benchmark. An ancestor known for a skill or a mistake becomes a reference point for later behaviour. Over time, such retellings do more than preserve events. They rank them. They shape emotion around them. They link them to people, places, and obligations. Memory becomes organised not just around what happened, but around what matters. This is a major shift. Language does not simply keep the past alive. It edits the past into social significance. And once significance enters, tribe becomes possible in a stronger sense. Humans did not need language in order to live in groups. Many animals do that perfectly well. But language transforms what a group can be because it allows the group to exist as an idea, not just a physical cluster of bodies. That distinction is crucial. A band of animals can move together, defend itself, and reproduce together without ever forming an explicit concept of shared ancestry or common destiny. Humans can do something different. They can name the group, recall its past, distinguish insiders from outsiders, identify lineages, recount shared ordeals, and speak of obligations that extend beyond immediate presence. That is tribe in a much deeper sense than proximity. It is membership held together by shared memory and repeated speech. Kinship terminology is one obvious part of this. Once relationships can be named with some stability, social life becomes much more manageable. People can distinguish mother from aunt, elder sibling from younger, a final relation from blood relation, child of one line from child of another. These distinctions affect marriage, inheritance, obligation, care, and alliance. They allow social networks to be extended and navigated with greater clarity. A named kin structure is not just a way of describing biological relationships. It is a tool for organising expected behaviour. Language gives those expectations a durable form. Place names matter for the same reason. A landscape without names can still be navigated, of course. People can recognise landmarks, routes, water sources, cliffs, groves, seasonal camps and hunting grounds. But once places are named, they become easier to store in collective memory and easier to discuss when absent. A named place can be warned about, celebrated, avoided, claimed, revisited, mourned, or remembered in connection with a story. Geography becomes social. It becomes part of identity. This valley is where something happened. That bend in the river belongs to the memory of a particular event or person. The land becomes layered with spoken significance. Speech also makes it easier to maintain cooperation across time. In a non-verbal or minimally verbal world, obligations are more tightly linked to immediate interaction. You help because the other person is there, because the need is visible, because the habit is established. With richer language, obligations can be discussed, remembered, deferred, negotiated, praised, or condemned. A promise becomes possible in a stronger sense. So does accusation. So does reputation. These things are extremely powerful in human groups. Reputation lets social information travel beyond direct experience. You may not have seen someone share generously, behave cruelly, or fail to assist when expected, but if others speak about it, that behaviour begins shaping future interactions. Language extends the social consequences of action. This is one reason gossip, which people often dismiss as trivial, may actually be a major force in human evolution. Gossip is not just idle chatter. At its most basic, it is the circulation of social information about absent others. Who can be trusted? Who is selfish? Who is skilled? Who is injured? Who broke a rule? In large enough groups, such information is essential. It lets cooperation scale beyond what one person can monitor alone. It also helps enforce norms. If bad behaviour can be discussed after the fact, then individuals face social consequences not only in the moment, but in future reputation. Language gives groups a way to regulate themselves without constant physical force. Norms themselves become much more durable once they can be spoken. A group may have long had repeated expectations about food sharing, childcare, mating, conflict, territory, and ritual behaviour. But language allows those expectations to be stated, taught, and defended more clearly. "We do not do that here" is a powerful kind of sentence, even in a simpler ancient form. It tells a listener that behaviour is being judged against a shared standard. Standards are the backbone of social order. Language lets them travel farther and survive longer. At the same time, this does not mean early human groups were constantly delivering formal speeches about policy and values around the fire. Most likely, norms were embedded in stories, corrections, examples, praise, teasing, warning, and remembered incidents. A child learns not only because someone states a rule, but because the group repeatedly tells what happened when that rule was ignored. Someone who shares food in a hard season may become a model. Someone who endangers others through carelessness may become a cautionary tale. This is how myth and memory begin to overlap. A remembered event becomes morally charged. Retelling turns it into instruction. Over generations, the precise details may shift, but the social lesson remains. This overlap may also be where ancestors begin to matter differently. Many animals recognize kin and remember social partners, but language allows the dead to remain socially active in a special way. Once people can speak of those who are gone, they can preserve personalities, actions, skills, debts, and lineages beyond the lifespan of any living witness. An ancestor becomes more than a genetic fact. They become a remembered social presence. Your mother's mother did this. He crossed that ridge in the flood season. That place is where our people lost someone. Such statements keep the dead within the living social world. This is one of the earliest foundations of historical consciousness. And historical consciousness, even in a very simple form, changes how a group behaves. A people with stories about their past is different from a people living only in the immediate present. The past becomes a guide, a source of legitimacy, a warning, or a model. Identity gains depth. We are the people who came from there. We are the ones who remember that season. We are related through this line. These are not small additions to life. They turn a band into a continuity. Continuity matters especially when groups begin interacting more often with other groups. Language allows distinctions between us and them to become more explicit and more meaningful. Some of that may be as simple as speech style. Even in modern life, accent and vocabulary can mark membership with surprising force. In prehistory, differences in speech may already have served as markers of identity, alliance, and separation. A shared way of speaking could signal trust and familiarity. A different way of speaking could signal distance, risk, trade opportunity, or potential conflict. Tribe becomes audible. Membership is not only seen in body decoration, movement patterns, or shared territory, it is heard. This can strengthen internal cohesion, but it can also sharpen boundaries. Language is a gift to cooperation, and a gift to exclusion at the same time. Once groups define themselves through shared speech, stories, and remembered ancestry, outsiders become easier to categorize. Sometimes that is useful. It allows alliances to be negotiated more carefully, dangers to be recognized, strangers to be placed. But it also sets the stage for suspicion, competition, and the very human habit of treating one's own group identity as especially meaningful, even when everyone involved is, in the end, a rather fragile primate trying to remain fed and warm. Still, one should not lose sight of the positive side of this development, which is enormous. Language allowed humans to build social worlds larger than any one individual's direct experience. It let them maintain a group identity across time, distribute practical knowledge, preserve memory, and encode value. A child born into such a group did not begin with nothing. They entered a spoken inheritance. The group had already named the world for them. It had already marked certain actions as admirable, foolish, dangerous, or sacred. It had already told itself how it came to be what it was. That is one of the reasons human culture can become so rich so quickly once language is established. Every new child enters not only a biological lineage, but a narrative one. This narrative inheritance is also what makes myth such a natural human product. Myth is what happens when memory stretches beyond personal witness and begins carrying larger explanatory weight. A story about where a people came from, why a place matters, why a rule exists, or why the world behaves as it does becomes useful not only because it may contain facts, but because it binds the group together around shared meaning. It answers the social question as much as the practical one. Why do we do this? Because this is our story. Why do we avoid that place? Because this happened there. Why are we bound to these people? Because we come from the same remembered line. Language gives those answers a durable form. As oral traditions grow, they also become selective. Groups remember what matters to their continuity. Some details are forgotten, others sharpened, others embroidered. This is not a flaw in the system. It is part of what makes oral memory adaptive. Memory is not only about accuracy, it is about relevance. A group preserves what helps it remain itself. That may include ecological knowledge, social rules, genealogies, origin stories, and memorable episodes that define the character of the people. Language is the medium through which all of this is rehearsed again and again until it becomes part of ordinary life. And ordinary life is exactly the point. Memory, myth, and tribe were not built only in ceremonial moments. They were built in constant low-level repetition, a place name used again, an ancestor mentioned again, a warning retold, a kin relation clarified, a joke that only works if everyone knows the same old story. The structure of group identity is assembled through countless such exchanges. By the time formal ritual or grand storytelling appears, the underlying machinery is already there. Language has spent generations weaving individual minds into a social fabric dense enough to hold more than immediate need. That woven fabric is one of the great human adaptations. It allows knowledge to survive bad seasons, deaths, migrations, injuries, and change. It lets small groups become coherent communities. It lets communities maintain themselves long enough to grow more elaborate forms of culture. And once that begins happening at scale, language starts doing even more than preserving memory and identity. It starts changing the direction of human history itself. Because a species that can store practical knowledge, teach it across generations, bind people with story, regulate norms with speech, and carry the dead forward through spoken remembrance, is no longer limited to the pace of biological change alone. It has found a second inheritance system, and that system is about to accelerate everything. By the time speech had become more than a tool for naming, warning, soothing, and remembering, it had already done something no other adaptation had ever quite managed in the same way. It had begun to change the speed at which humans could change themselves. Claws do not improve by being discussed. Fur does not become thicker because a group tells stories about winter. A sharper tooth is useful, but it dies with the body that carries it. Speech is different. Once a human group can speak with enough precision to pass on knowledge, compare experiences, coordinate plans, preserve lessons, and build shared rules, the species is no longer limited to what evolution can shape through bone and muscle alone. It can begin evolving culturally at a pace biology alone could never match. That is the real sense in which speech changed human history. Not because the first complete sentence rang out across the landscape like a trumpet announcing civilization, but because language allowed one lifetime to accumulate inside the next. Before that point, every generation still learned, of course. Young individuals watched elders, copied techniques, absorbed habits, and adapted to local conditions. But there were limits. Without strong spoken language, complex skills are slower to teach, fragile to preserve, and harder to modify deliberately. A useful discovery may spread only through direct imitation. A mistake may have to be repeated many times before it becomes a stable caution, A strategy may be hard to explain if it depends on timing, sequence, or conditions not presently visible. In such a world, culture exists, but it moves with difficulty. Once speech becomes precise and widely shared, culture becomes cumulative. That is the turning point. Knowledge no longer merely survives, it stacks. This stacking changes nearly everything. A person does not need to discover alone which plants can be eaten safely, how to shape a stone core for more efficient cutting edges, where the herd tends to turn when startled in dry grass, or which river crossing becomes treacherous after heavy rain. They can be told. More importantly, they can be told before the mistake is made. That matters because natural selection works slowly, but instruction works immediately. A lesson can be delivered in an afternoon. A warning can save a life that same day. A technique explained well can be improved within a generation instead of over countless ones. Speech gives humans a second route to adaptation, one built not on genetic inheritance alone, but on the transfer of structured knowledge. This may be the single most important advantage language ever gave our species. It let us stop beginning from scratch. That sounds obvious because none of us does begin from scratch. We are born into worlds already named, already explained, already full of inherited skill and inherited error. We learn from people who learned from people who learned from people, stretching back through a chain so long that most of what we know is impossible to trace to any first discoverer. But there was a time when that chain was much shorter and far less secure. Speech lengthened it. Once it did, every group that used language well became more than a cluster of individuals. It became a storage system. Stored knowledge changes daily life first. Toolmaking becomes more stable, because instructions can accompany demonstration. Hunting improves because strategies can be discussed before the animals appear. Food sharing can be organised more efficiently because intentions can be stated rather than merely guessed. Childcare becomes more distributed because needs can be reported, delegated and explained. Injuries become less isolating because care can be coordinated. Even conflict changes because grievances, accusations and reconciliations can be voiced rather than left to pure display or force. Human social life becomes denser and more manageable once speech can carry detail. Then the effect spread outward. A group with good language can coordinate over larger distances and longer timescales. It can split up and reunite with better planning. It can maintain social ties among individuals who are not constantly in physical contact. It can send someone to fetch, scout, carry, or warn with more exact understanding of what is required. This is one of the reasons speech becomes so important in a mobile species. Humans do not merely inhabit a single fixed point in the environment. They move through territory, remember paths, revisit places, and anticipate seasonal change. Language makes territory mentally navigable in a much richer way. A place can be described, not just recognized. A route can be planned, not just retraced. A region can be known socially before it is known personally. That has consequences for expansion. One of the extraordinary facts about our species is that humans spread into an immense variety of environments. Grasslands, forests, coasts, cold regions, river valleys, uplands, dry zones, and eventually almost every habitable niche on the planet. This required more than physical flexibility. It required cultural flexibility, and cultural flexibility depends heavily on language. A group moving into new terrain must identify new dangers, new opportunities, new seasonal patterns, new animal behaviours, and new useful materials. If every person had to learn these things mostly alone, expansion would be slow and wasteful. If knowledge can be pooled and passed on in words, adaptation becomes faster. One person's discovery becomes everyone's advantage. This is where speech starts to change history in the full sense. It does not merely improve one task, it changes the rate at which tasks can be improved across generations. A new hunting method can be explained. A better way of hafting a tool can be described. A food processing trick can be preserved. A child can inherit not just genes for a certain kind of body, but instructions for a certain kind of life. Culture begins outpacing biology and shaping survival. Humans are still animals, still dependent on their bodies, still subject to hunger, disease, climate, injury, and death. But they are no longer only biological creatures in evolutionary terms. They become cultural accumulators. You can see this in the archaeological record, though never as cleanly as one might like. Technologies appear, persist, alter, diversify, and sometimes spread over wide areas. Some of this can happen with imitation alone, certainly, but once technologies become more complex, the case for language becomes stronger. Composite tools, coordinated hunting, repeated control of fire, symbolic marking, long-distance exchange, and increasingly elaborate social organization all become easier to maintain in a species that can explain what it is doing. It would be far too simple to say that language single-handedly caused every major change in human prehistory, but it would be equally mistaken to understate its role. Speech made complexity easier to preserve. Preservation matters because memory is otherwise cruelly fragile. A skilled toolmaker dies, and their hands die with them. A gifted tracker grows old, and unless the knowledge has been transferred, the group loses more than a person. It loses part of its competence. Speech softens that blow. Skills can be externalized. Procedures can be narrated. Patterns can be named. Correction can happen before the learner has failed too often. This does not eliminate loss, of course. Many discoveries surely vanished anyway. Human history is full of broken chains. But language makes chains more resilient. It gives culture better odds. Speech also changes how humans cooperate at larger scales. A small group can coordinate much through habit, familiarity, and immediate feedback. Larger groups require more explicit management. Once populations grow, disperse, reunite, trade, ally, and compete across wider networks, language becomes even more valuable. It allows people to negotiate, promise, warn, and explain. It supports role differentiation. One person can specialize more if others can be taught what they need to know about that specialization. Division of labor becomes more practical. Leadership becomes more than physical dominance. Persuasion enters. So does planning. A species that can talk can organize itself in ways that physical signals alone would never sustain. This may also be where the social consequences become especially dramatic. Speech lets groups create rules that exist even when no one is presently enforcing them. A spoken norm can live in memory. We share in hard seasons. We do not cross that boundary. This obligation belongs to that kin line. That place is dangerous at this time of year. Rules like these do not have to be written to matter. Spoken enough, they become part of the invisible structure within which people live. And once rules become durable, institutions in the broadest sense begin to exist. Not governments in any formal way, not yet, but stable expectations bigger than any one person's immediate mood. This is important because institutions, even simple ones, are a major force in history. They make behavior predictable. They let larger numbers of people cooperate. They preserve order beyond the reach of one memory or one pair of hands. Language is what makes those invisible structures possible in the first place. A group with speech can create obligations, permissions, taboos, and shared categories that outlast the moment of utterance. That is a profound step away from purely reactive social life. Trade likely changed as well. Even very early exchange networks become easier to maintain once people can describe what they have, what they want, where something came from, and when someone can be expected to return. Long before formal markets, humans were likely exchanging goods, favours, and information. Language turns exchange from a simple handover into a negotiable relationship. You can promise future return. You can establish reciprocity. You can tell someone where to find a material. You can report who else has access to it. These may seem small things, but they widen the social map dramatically. Another consequence is innovation itself. Innovation is often imagined as the work of an exceptional individual, and certainly gifted individuals matter. But without language, innovation struggles to spread or even stabilize. A new idea must be demonstrated repeatedly, and others may misunderstand or fail to reproduce it. With speech, an innovator can not only show, but explain. They can draw attention to the critical feature. They can warn against the common error. They can persuade others to try the method. They can answer questions. In that sense, language does not just preserve innovation. It makes innovation more likely to survive the dangerous early stage when it is new, fragile, and easy to lose. This cumulative effect eventually becomes visible on a much larger scale. Symbolic behavior intensifies, tools diversify, group identities sharpen, long-distance networks appear, ritual becomes more elaborate, art emerges in durable forms. None of these can be reduced to language alone, but all are supported by it. Symbolic culture is much easier to maintain when people can explain what the symbols mean. A painted mark on a body, a carved object, a decorated burial, a repeated communal practice, all gain depth when there is speech around them. Language turns symbol into system. It also turns time into a more usable dimension. Animals can anticipate and remember, of course, but speech allows humans to coordinate around futures that do not yet exist. A group can plan a movement for the next season. It can prepare for scarcity before scarcity arrives. It can organize labor in advance. It can remember not just what happened, but what should happen again under similar conditions. This kind of temporal organization is one of the great hidden powers of speech. It lets humans live partly in the future. Much of history is built from that alone. A species that can act in the present on the basis of collectively discussed future possibilities is operating on a different level from one limited mostly to immediate cues. That may be why speech feels less like one innovation among many and more like a multiplier. Fire matters, tools matter, social care matters, memory matters. But speech amplifies all of them. It lets fire use be taught, tool use be refined, care be coordinated, memory be pooled. Once language is sufficiently developed, almost every other human advantage becomes easier to extend across time and community. That is the moment history, in the deepest sense, begins to accelerate. It is also the moment human childhood becomes even more significant. A long childhood is expensive. It requires food, attention, protection, and patience, on a scale many animals do not provide. But in a language-rich species, a long childhood becomes a remarkable advantage because it allows more cultural loading. Children do not simply grow into adults physically. They are filled with the group's categories, stories, rules, techniques, place names, kin structures, rituals, habits, and expectations. Speech makes upbringing far denser. By the time a child reaches maturity, they may carry centuries of social selection in spoken form, all without having personally discovered any of it. That means language also changes inheritance. Biological inheritance remains, of course, but cultural inheritance becomes increasingly important. A child inherits a world already interpreted. They inherit distinctions between safe and unsafe, proper and improper, friend and outsider, sacred and ordinary, edible and forbidden, clever and foolish. These are not all true in any objective sense, nor are they all equally wise, but they all shape behaviour. Human history becomes, to a large extent, the story of what different groups pass on through speech, and how those inherited patterns guide action. And action guided by inherited language can become very large indeed. Once social memory extends across generations, projects can outlast individuals. A group can return to the same places season after season because the root and reason are known. It can preserve long-term alliances. It can sustain rituals whose original circumstances are no longer remembered firsthand. Eventually, much later, it can build monuments, laws, agriculture, kingdoms, and scholarly traditions. Those later forms are far beyond the earlier speakers, of course. But the underlying principle is the same. Speech allows human effort to accumulate across lives. History is what that accumulation looks like from a distance. There is a more intimate side to this too. Speech changed human history because it changed human relationships. It allowed new kinds of closeness. A parent could explain, not merely soothe. A partner could promise, not merely remain near. Friends could recall shared experience in detail. A dying person could pass on more than example. Grief became different when the dead could be spoken of extensively. Love became different when it could be declared, argued over, remembered, and woven into story. Even selfhood changed. Once humans could tell stories about themselves, identity became more narrative. A person could describe who they'd been, what they had done, what they intended, and how they wished to be understood. History became personal before it became civilizational. Of course, speech did not bring only benefits. A species that can communicate richly can also deceive richly. It can coordinate violence more effectively. It can preserve bad ideas just as well as useful ones. It can build exclusions, suspicions, and hierarchies with greater durability. Words can maintain peace, but they can also inflame conflict. They can bind a group together and turn that group against another. The same symbolic power that allows myth and memory can also allow prejudice and propaganda. Human history, unfortunately, demonstrates this rather thoroughly. So when we say speech changed history, we should not imagine a purely noble transformation. It was a multiplication of possibility, for good and ill alike. Yet even with that caution, the overall effect is unmistakable. Once speech reached a certain threshold of flexibility, precision, and social importance, the human world became a place where knowledge could travel farther than bodies, where the dead could influence the living, where the absent could matter, where plans could outrun the moment, and where cooperation could scale beyond direct perception. That's not just a refinement of ape communication. It is a new mode of existence, and the remarkable thing is that it may not have felt dramatic from the inside. No ancestor needed to know they were standing at the hinge of history. They only needed to speak to a child, warn a companion, recount a track, settle a dispute, teach a cut, name a place, repeat a story, or make a plan. The transformation happened because these ordinary acts kept adding up. Thousands of evenings, thousands of corrections, thousands of names repeated and remembered, thousands of small improvements passed on rather than lost. History changed because speech made continuity possible in a species unusually eager to learn from itself. By the time the process was fully underway, humanity had crossed a line as important as any in its past. We were no longer just creatures adapting to the world. We were creatures increasingly able to adapt through shared explanation, shared memory, and shared imagination. And once shared imagination enters the story, one final question remains waiting in the dark just beyond the firelight. What exactly did those first spoken words leave behind inside us? Because even now, after all the cities, books, machines, archives, and noise, every human voice still carries the trace of that first long transformation, and the echo of those earlier speakers has never really gone silent. The first words are gone. If there ever was a single first word, and there probably was not, no trace of it remains. It left no inscription, no fossil, no neat little artifact tucked into the soil, waiting for archaeologists to brush it clean and announce that this at last was the beginning. Speech does not preserve itself that way. It vanishes almost as soon as it is made. A sound leaves the mouth, enters the air, touches another ear, and then it is gone. That has always been the strange thing about language. It is one of the most powerful forces in human history, and yet in its natural form it is made of disappearances. A word exists for a moment, and then only in memory. A sentence lives just long enough to be understood, repeated, answered, or forgotten. And still, from those vanishing sounds, humans built families, rules, stories, tools, alliances, rituals, trade, grief, comfort, and eventually the entire great cluttered arrangement we now call civilization. That is why the echo of the first words matters, not because we can recover them, but because they never really stopped sounding through us. Every human voice alive today carries the result of that long transformation. Every lullaby, every argument, every whispered apology, every instruction passed across a kitchen, every joke told too loudly in the wrong room, every child asking why for the 17th time in 6 minutes, every elder repeating a story that has outlived several houses and a few governments, all of it rests on the same deep inheritance. The first spoken word did not vanish. It multiplied. One of the easiest mistakes to make is to imagine ancient speech as primitive in the sense of being incomplete, as though the first real speakers were halfway to us and somehow less fully human because their vocabularies were smaller, their stories shorter, or their sound systems different from those we know now. But that is not quite right. Once language became robust enough to support social life in a serious way, it was already doing the essential work that language still does. It connected minds, it carried memory, it coordinated action, it stabilized identity, it allowed one person to alter another person's understanding without touching them. That is the miracle, if one wants to use that word carefully. Not that people eventually compose philosophy or law or theatre, but that a species of social primate learned how to move ideas from one skull to another with breath and muscle. That achievement is still with us at the most ordinary scale. Consider how early it begins. A baby enters the world with no words, but not with no preparation. The infant brain is listening almost immediately, sorting voices from other sounds, noticing rhythm, stress, repetition, contour. Long before a child can explain anything, they're already being shaped by speech. A caregiver's voice soothes them. Repeated names begin to stick. The rhythm of a household becomes familiar. Later comes babbling, that magnificent period of experimental acoustics in which tiny humans appear to be testing every possible mouth shape with tireless determination and no concern whatsoever for anyone else's sleep schedule. Those sounds are not random noise, they are rehearsal. They are ancient development replayed in miniature. The child is doing what our species has done for a very long time, turning a body into an instrument for shared meaning. There is something deeply revealing in the way children acquire language. No one sits them down with a complete grammar and dignified lecture on clause structure. They learn in the middle of life. They hear words attached to actions, objects, faces, moods, routines. They listen to repeated phrases. They make guesses. They overgeneralize. They invent errors that are often more logical than the adult forms they are supposed to master. They say things no one explicitly taught them because they are extracting patterns from the speech around them. In this sense, every child recapitulates not the full history of language, certainly not in any literal biological sense, but something of its essential social character. Language lives because it is passed on in use. The echo of the first word survives because each generation enters a human world already speaking, and speech does not only shape the young, it continues shaping thought all through life. Much of human thinking is partly linguistic. We rehearse what we might say, we narrate events to ourselves, we argue internally, plan aloud, mutter through problems, silently label what we notice, and revisit old conversations with the irritating precision of a brain, apparently determined to provide commentary long after it is useful. Inner speech is one of the quiet descendants of outer speech. The voice that ancient humans used to coordinate with others eventually became part of how we coordinate with ourselves. Even now, the old social technology lives inside the private mind. That may be one reason silence feels so unusual to modern humans. Not merely the absence of external noise, but the absence of language itself. Most of us are almost never outside its reach. We wake into a world of labels, instructions, headlines, notifications, signs, remembered conversations, expected conversations, and words waiting in the mouth. We inhabit a planet overlaid with speech. That overlay is so complete that it can be hard to imagine what the world would feel like without it, A forest is not just trees and sound and path. It is also names, warnings, categories, stories, and remembered advice. A face is not only eyes and mouth and expression. It is a person with a name, a history, a role, a relationship, a set of previous statements, a collection of promises kept or broken. Language deepens everything by linking the present to the absent. It also links us to people we never met. When an older person teaches a child a phrase, a proverb, a place name, a family story, or even a particular way of pronouncing a familiar word, they are passing along far more than information. They are transmitting continuity. Accent itself is a kind of living fossil, not in the strict scientific sense, but as a reminder that history remains audible. Speech carries traces of migration, contact, isolation, class, region, and ancestry. A person's way of speaking can hold generations inside it. Even very small differences in rhythm or sound may reflect long histories of people moving, mixing, separating, adapting, and remembering. The first words are gone, but their descendants are everywhere, branching through time in thousands of languages and thousands more varieties within them. That branching is part of the wonder. Language did not emerge once and remain fixed. It spread, divided, changed, borrowed, forgot, invented, softened, sharpened, drifted, collided, and reassembled. Human groups carried speech into deserts, tundra, forests, islands, plains, and mountains. New environments shaped new vocabularies. New contacts introduced new words. New social needs produced new distinctions. Yet beneath all that variation, the deeper pattern remained. Breath shaped by anatomy, ordered by the brain, stabilized by community, passed on through care and repetition. The same species that once struggled to turn sound into stable symbol eventually filled the earth with speech forms so numerous that no one person could hear even a fraction of them in a lifetime, and every one of those languages does the same basic human work. It remembers, it instructs, it warns, it jokes, it names kin, it marks belonging, it allows grief to be shared rather than merely endured in silence. It lets a person explain a technique, confess a mistake, express affection, challenge a rival, bargain for help, or tell a child to move away from the fire before something regrettable happens. That last one, in particular, must be one of the oldest and most reliable functions of speech in the history of our species. There is also the matter of the voice itself, not just the words it carries. Long before language became elaborate, tone mattered. A soothing voice calmed, a harsh one warned, a fearful one spread urgency. That ancient layer never disappeared. Even now, much of what we understand in speech is not lexical at all. We hear mood, intention, irony, tenderness, impatience, confidence, uncertainty. We can often tell before the content is processed whether a conversation is welcome or unwelcome, safe or tense, affectionate or dangerous. This too is part of the echo. The human voice still carries its older animal inheritance within the newer symbolic system. We are not creatures of pure abstract language. We are creatures whose meaning is always mixed with breath, body, tone, and relation. Perhaps that is why spoken language remains so powerful, even in an age of writing and screens. Writing can preserve words across centuries, which is astonishing in its own way, but speech still feels closer. It is embodied, it is timed, it is directed, it arrives with rhythm and emphasis and hesitation. It can break in the middle, it can be corrected, softened, intensified, withdrawn. It can carry care in a way that text often has to work much harder to imitate. A spoken reassurance is not just a set of lexical items. It is a person using the ancient instrument of the body to calm another nervous system. In that sense, the oldest human use of speech remains entirely current. You can see this especially in moments of stress, exhaustion, and tenderness. When people are frightened, they often call out. When they're grieving, they speak names. When they are comforting a child, they use the voice in patterned, repetitive ways that are probably very old. When they gather to remember the dead, they tell stories. When they celebrate, they sing, toast, chant, or recount. When they fall in love, they begin attaching language to another person in special ways. Private names, remembered phrases, repeated reassurances. All of this is culture, yes, but it is also biology meeting history in the mouth. The first words echo not because we remember them exactly, but because we still use speech for the same deep social work. There is an irony here. Language gave humans a way to preserve memory beyond any single life, and yet spoken language itself is always perishable. Every conversation disappears unless recorded or remembered. Most of what humanity has ever said is gone forever. The vast majority of ancient speech vanished without a trace. The first jokes, the first arguments, the first lullabies, the first whispered warnings in the dark, the first names for places now buried under changed coastlines and different skies, all lost. And still, what mattered was not the survival of each utterance, it was the survival of the system. Language does not endure by preserving every sound. It endures by teaching new mouths to make new sounds that do the same kind of work. That may be the clearest sense in which the first words still echo. They do not survive as preserved specimens. They survive as a living capacity constantly renewed. Every time one person successfully says something and another understands, the ancient bargain holds. Air becomes structure. Structure becomes thought shared. The impossible-seeming bridge between minds is built again for a moment and then allowed to vanish, because it can always be rebuilt with the next sentence. Humans rely on this so completely that we rarely stop to notice how strange it is. We assume understanding is normal. We forget that the whole exchange depends on bodies evolved for speech, brains evolved for symbolic pattern, communities evolved for shared convention, and countless generations of cultural transmission. The modern world, for all its complexity, has not changed that foundation. We now use microphones, telephones, radios, recordings, satellites, and digital systems that can send speech across oceans in fractions of a second. We can hear voices of the dead. We can translate speech into text and text back into speech. We can archive lectures, songs, arguments, and bedtime stories. Yet beneath all of that machinery, the core event is ancient. A human voice enters another human ear and changes what the listener knows, feels, expects, or remembers. The technologies are new. The act itself is old. And perhaps it is older in us than we realize. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to spoken language. Certain brain systems respond to it with special readiness. Infants prefer speech-like sounds. We notice when someone says our name from across a noisy room. We react emotionally to tone even before content is fully processed. We can be moved by languages we do not understand because the voice carries more than literal meaning. All of this suggests a species deeply shaped by speech over evolutionary time. We are not just users of language. We are creatures built around it. Even our social suffering often takes linguistic form. Shame can be tied to remembered words. Comfort can come from being told something we need to hear at exactly the right moment. Whole relationships can hinge on what was said, what was left unsaid, what was misunderstood, or what was finally spoken after a very long delay. This is not a side effect of civilization. It is part of what language does once it enters a species with memory, attachment, and self-awareness. The first words did not merely help us hunt or teach. They changed the emotional landscape of being human. They made it possible to revisit the past in speech, to anticipate the future in speech, and to live with others not only in shared space, but in shared narrative. Shared narrative may be the deepest echo of all. Humans do not simply communicate information. We tell ourselves what is happening, what has happened, who we are, and what should come next. Families do it, communities do it, nations do it, religions do it, Friends do it over dinner. Individuals do it in the privacy of thought. Speech turned life into something that could be narrated, and once life can be narrated, it can be interpreted. That is where meaning enters at full force. Not just the meaning of a word, but the meaning of a life, an event, a loss, a place, a people. The first words open that possibility, and we have been living inside it ever since. It is worth pausing, too, on the fragility of this inheritance. Languages can disappear. Words can be lost. Entire speech traditions can fall silent when communities are broken, displaced, forbidden to speak, or absorbed into stronger linguistic systems. When a language dies, it is not only a set of vocabulary items that vanishes. It is a way of organizing memory, landscape, kinship, humor, rhythm, emphasis, and worldview. In that sense, the echo of the first words depends on care. Each generation receives language from others, but it must also keep it alive in practice. Speech survives in mouths, not in theory. This makes the simplest acts feel a little more significant. A grandparent teaching a child the name of a bird. A family keeping alive an old phrase that no one outside the household quite understands. A community telling the same story in the same cadence every year. A person speaking softly to someone who is frightened. These are not small things in the deeper history of our species. They are the continuation of the ancient human project, turning sound into memory shared. And so, after all this wandering through throats and genes, tools and fires, memory and tribe, we arrive at a truth so ordinary that it can be difficult to see. Speech did not only change what humans could do, it changed what humans could be to one another. It let us become teachers of the absent, keepers of the dead, planners of the unseen, makers of belonging, preservers of place, and carriers of meanings too large for one life. That is the echo. Not a literal repetition of the first word, whatever that might have been, but the continued vibration of the first successful bridge from one human mind into another. And now, here you are, farther along in this story than when we began, listening to one more human voice in the long chain. Perhaps you're hearing this late, when the day has gone quiet and the mind begins to soften around the edges. Perhaps there are other sounds in the room, a fan, distant traffic, a house settling, someone moving in another part of the building. Perhaps you're nearly asleep, but even in this calm moment, something very old is happening. Breath is becoming meaning. Meaning is becoming thought shared. The same ancient system that once helped a small group survive a dark landscape is now carrying a reflection across time into your evening. So let me ask you gently, one last time, where are you listening from tonight, and what are the last few words you heard before sleep begins to pull at them? It is a strange comfort, isn't it, that after everything humans have built, after all the noise and all the history, so much still comes down to this: a voice, a listener, and a moment of understanding passing between them. If this quiet journey kept you company, taught you something, or simply gave your thoughts a softer place to rest, I'd be very grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared it with someone else who might enjoy drifting off inside a good question. And for now, wherever you are, in whatever little corner of the world your own voice has made alive, sleep well. The first words are long gone, but their echo is still here, still human, still speaking softly in the dark.